Welcome to Mr. Nightveil. Over 300,000 crew members work on cruise ships worldwide, living in windowless cabins below deck for months at a time. Have you ever wondered what they witness when passengers are asleep? Tonight, 10 former crew members share what they experienced at sea. For privacy, names and identifying details have been altered, but these stories are real. Before we begin, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is. Hit subscribe, because these testimonials will haunt you. Let's see how many of you are brave enough to watch this alone at night. My name is Yuretsi, and I worked as a cabin steward for one of the major cruise lines from 2018 until I quit in 2020. I need to tell you about cabin B147 because what happened there still keeps me awake at night. And I think people deserve to know the truth about what really goes on below deck when something terrible happens. I was 29 when this started, and I'd been working ships for about 4 years at that point. I thought I'd seen everything. I'd cleaned up after seasick passengers, dealt with entitled guests who treated us like we were invisible, and worked 16-hour shifts in corridors with no windows and air that always smelled recycled. But nothing prepared me for that cabin. It started on a Tuesday morning. I remember because Tuesdays were turnaround days, when one set of passengers left and another boarded, which meant our most intense cleaning shifts. My supervisor, Harvey, pulled me aside during our morning briefing and told me I'd been reassigned to B deck for the next cruise. He didn't make eye contact when he said it, just handed me the key card and a special cleaning supplies cart I'd never seen before. The cart had extra bottles of industrial cleaner, new linens still in plastic, and these thick rubber gloves that went up past my elbows. When I asked why I needed all that, Harvey just said there'd been a medical emergency in one of the cabins, and it needed deep cleaning before the next guests arrived. Medical emergency was the term we used for everything from heart attacks to people dying in their sleep. So I didn't think much of it at first. Cabin B147 was at the end of a long corridor on the starboard side. One of those inside cabins with no windows that we gave to budget passengers. The moment I opened the door, I felt something was off. The air inside was absolutely freezing, which made no sense because the thermostat on the wall showed 75 degrees. I could see my breath. I checked the vents, thinking maybe the AC was malfunctioning, but they were barely pushing any air at all. The cabin looked normal enough at first glance. The bed was stripped, personal items were gone, but there was this smell I couldn't identify. Not like death or anything obvious, just this wet, stale smell like old water that had been sitting too long. I started with the standard protocol. Strip everything down, bag the mattress pad, check for any bodily fluids that needed special treatment. That's when I noticed the bathroom. The floor around the shower was wet, and I mean soaking wet, like someone had just gotten out. But the cabin had been empty for 12 hours, according to the manifest. I mopped it up, scrubbed everything with the industrial cleaner until my eyes watered from the fumes, and moved on. 3 hours later, when I came back to do a final inspection before putting on fresh linens, the bathroom floor was wet again. Same spot, same puddle spreading out from the shower. I checked every pipe, every seal, every possible place water could leak from. Nothing. Everything was bone dry except that floor. I finished the cleaning, logged it as complete, and tried to forget about it. The next guests checked in that afternoon. By midnight, I got a call from the guest services desk. The couple in B147 wanted to speak with a manager. They were demanding a room change. When I asked what the problem was, the desk agent lowered her voice and said they were claiming they could hear a woman crying in the bathroom. Not in another cabin, not in the hallway, but specifically in their bathroom. They said it sounded like someone was in the shower, sobbing. Security checked it out, found nothing, and the guests were moved to a different cabin. Management wasn't happy about it, because we were fully booked and reshuffling rooms caused all kinds of problems with the system. The cabin stayed empty for 2 days because we hit some ports where hardly anyone booked the inside cabins. I was relieved. But then we had another turnaround, and B147 got booked again. This time it was a single woman, traveling alone. She lasted 6 hours. 6 hours before she came to the desk, pale and shaking, refusing to go back to the room even to get her things. She told the night manager that she'd taken a nap and woke up to wet footprints on the carpet, leading from the bathroom to the side of her bed. She'd been alone in the cabin with the door locked. Security retrieved her belongings, and she spent the rest of the cruise in the guest lounge, refusing to sleep in any cabin at all. That's when Harvey told me the truth. He pulled me into the crew mess during my break and finally admitted what the medical emergency had been. A woman in her 50s had been found in cabin B147 in the bathtub, 3 days into the previous cruise. Her husband had died 2 months earlier, and she'd booked the cruise alone. The steward who found her said the cabin was flooded, water everywhere, like she'd left the shower running for hours. They did what they always do in these situations. Contacted the family, stored the body in the morgue we keep below deck, filed paperwork with the Coast Guard, and kept sailing. The cruise doesn't stop for death. It never does. They cleaned the cabin according to protocol, which is supposed to involve special crews and specific chemicals. But we were short-staffed that week, so they just had the regular stewards do it. That's why they gave me the special cart. They were trying to fix their mistake. I asked Harvey why he didn't tell me this before. He said corporate policy was to never disclose that information to crew or guests because it created unnecessary anxiety and hurt business. People die on cruise ships more often than anyone wants to admit. Usually it's elderly passengers, natural causes, and we just deal with it quietly. But this one felt different to him, he said. The steward who originally found her, a woman named Adele who'd worked ships for 12 years, refused to work B-deck anymore. She'd requested a transfer to a different ship entirely and took a pay cut to make it happen. She wouldn't talk about what she saw in that cabin, just said she'd never go back there and neither should anyone else. I should have listened. I should have requested a transfer right then. But I needed the job. And I'd just sent money home to my family, and switching ships meant potentially weeks without work. So I agreed to keep cleaning B147, and Harvey promised me extra overtime pay. The cabin got booked again 3 days later. A businessman, traveling alone for a conference. He didn't even make it through the first night. He called security at 3 a.m, saying someone was in his cabin. He could hear breathing in the bathroom and the door handle turning. But when security arrived, he was alone, and the bathroom door was locked from the inside. When they opened it, the mirror was completely fogged over like someone had just taken a hot shower, and there was that puddle again on the floor. After that, management decided to take the cabin out of rotation for the rest of the cruise. That meant I had to go in every other day to air it out and make sure nothing grew mold in the humidity. I hated those visits. I'd prop the door open, turn on every light, and try to get in and out as fast as possible. But the cabin had this way of making you feel like you weren't alone. I'd be changing towels and get this overwhelming sensation that someone was standing in the bathroom doorway watching me. I'd turn around and nobody would be there. But I could swear I'd seen movement in my peripheral vision. The temperature thing got worse too. Even with the door open and warm corridor air flowing in, that cabin stayed cold. Other stewards started avoiding that whole section of B deck. If I asked someone to cover my shift, they'd agree to everything except B147. Then I started hearing it. The crying. It always happened when I was in the cabin alone, usually in the late afternoon when most passengers were at dinner or shows. At first, I thought it was pipes, or sound carrying from another cabin. But the more I listened, the more I realized it was coming from inside the bathroom. A woman's voice, sobbing like her heart was broken, like she'd lost everything. I'd stand in the doorway of the bathroom, listening to this impossible sound, and the temperature would drop even further. I started seeing my breath in there even though I could hear the thermostat clicking on, trying to heat the space. The worst part was the shower. I'd cleaned enough bathrooms to know what a dry shower curtain feels like versus one that's been used recently. The curtain in B147 was always damp on the inside, always. I'd check it in the morning, bone dry. Come back 6 hours later, and it would be wet again, clinging to the side of the tub like someone had just rinsed off. No water in the tub, no drips from the shower head, just that damp curtain and the puddle on the floor that never fully dried, no matter how many times I mopped it. I tried telling Harvey I couldn't do it anymore. I went to him after a shift where I'd spent 45 minutes in that cabin and heard the crying the entire time. I told him something was seriously wrong with that room, that it needed to be inspected by maintenance or engineering or someone who could figure out what was happening. He looked at me like I was being dramatic. He said passengers always complained about cabins, that people heard things on ships all the time because of the engine noise and the way sound traveled through the ventilation system. He said if I couldn't handle basic cabin maintenance, maybe I wasn't cut out for cruise work. Then he reminded me that we were in the middle of the ocean. I was under contract. And unless I wanted to be sent home without pay, I needed to finish my rotation. So I kept going back. I kept cleaning that cabin, kept hearing that crying, kept mopping up water that shouldn't exist. I started having nightmares about it. I'd dream I was in the cabin and the bathroom door would open by itself. And I'd see a woman standing in the shower with water running over her, staring at me with empty eyes. I'd wake up in my crew quarters gasping for air, and my roommate would ask if I was okay. But how could I explain it? How could I tell her I was terrified of a cabin, that I felt like something was trying to communicate with me, that I couldn't shake the feeling the woman who died in there was still present somehow, still suffering? The final incident happened 3 weeks before the end of my contract. I'd gone into B147 late at night because I'd forgotten to restock the toiletries earlier. The corridor was empty. Most passengers were at the late show or in the casino. I unlocked the door and immediately knew something was different. The cold hit me like a wave, colder than it had ever been. I could hear the crying before I even stepped inside, louder and more desperate than before. And the bathroom light was on. I knew I'd turned it off. I always turned off the lights. I stood in the doorway, frozen, listening to those sobs echoing off the tile. Then I heard my name. Not yelled, not whispered, but spoken clearly in a woman's voice filled with grief. Yuretsi. Like she knew me, like she'd been waiting for me. I ran. I left the door open, dropped my supplies in the hallway, and ran back to the crew quarters. I told Harvey the next morning I was done. I didn't care about the contract or the pay or anything else. I couldn't go back to that cabin. He tried to convince me to stay, said I was being irrational, but I could see it in his eyes. He knew something was wrong with that room too. They all did. They just didn't want to admit it because admitting it meant acknowledging that some things can't be cleaned away, that some tragedies leave marks that don't fade. I left the ship at the next port and never went back. I heard later that they finally took B-147 out of rotation permanently, converted it to storage space. But I still think about that woman sometimes, alone in that cabin, so devastated by loss that she couldn't bear to leave the ship. I think about how we just cleaned up and booked the next guest, like her death didn't matter. And I think about how many other cabins on how many other ships have stories like this. Stories that management will never tell you. Stories that crew members carry with them long after they leave the sea. My name is Marcus, and I spent 6 years working as an engine technician on cruise ships running Caribbean routes. What I'm about to tell you happened back in 2015, and I've never spoken publicly about it because honestly, I didn't think anyone would believe me. But after what I discovered in the lower maintenance decks, I can't stay quiet anymore. People need to understand that these massive ships have areas passengers never see, places so deep in the hull that even most crew members don't go there. And sometimes, those spaces hide things that shouldn't exist. I was 34 at the time, and I'd worked my way up from a basic maintenance position to a senior engine tech role. My job involved inspecting the mechanical systems in the restricted zones below the waterline, places where the real guts of the ship operated. We're talking about massive engine rooms that generated enough power to move 12 decks worth of passengers and crew through the ocean, water treatment facilities, electrical systems, and miles of crawl spaces filled with pipes and cables. The work was hot, loud, and isolated. During night shifts, you could go hours without seeing another person. It was just you, the constant rumble of the engines, and the metal corridors that all looked exactly the same. The incident started during a routine inspection on a Tuesday night. We were 3 days into a 7-day cruise, and I'd been assigned to check a section of the lower maintenance deck that we only accessed once per voyage. This area was behind the main engine room, a network of narrow passages where emergency backup systems and redundant piping ran. You needed special authorization to even have a key card for those sections. I was with my supervisor Cyrus that night, a guy who'd worked ships for 15 years and had seen just about everything. We were doing a standard walkthrough, checking for leaks, unusual vibrations, anything that might indicate a problem developing. About 40 minutes into the inspection, we reached a section that required us to crawl through a particularly tight accessway. These weren't meant for regular use, just emergency access points for repairs. Cyrus went first, and I heard him stop moving about halfway through. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then his voice came back through the passage, and it sounded wrong. He told me to come look at something. When I reached him, I understood why he'd gone quiet. Someone had forced open an access hatch that led to a crawl space above the water treatment pipes. This hatch was supposed to be welded shut. It had been for years, according to our maintenance logs. But the metal around the lock was bent outward, and I mean seriously damaged, like someone had pried it open with a crowbar from the inside. That detail stuck with me immediately. From the inside. We squeezed through the opening and dropped down into the crawl space with our flashlights. What we found made no sense. Someone had been living there. There was a makeshift bed constructed from emergency blankets, the kind we kept in the lifeboats. Food wrappers were scattered around, mostly protein bars and crackers from the crew provisions. Empty water bottles were lined up against one wall. But it was the drawings that made my skin crawl. Someone had used something sharp to scratch images into the metal walls. Not random graffiti, but detailed drawings, schematics of the ship's layout, deck plans showing corridors, crew quarters, passenger areas. And on those drawings, there were X marks, dozens of them, scratched deep into the metal, marking specific crew cabins on decks 5 and 6. Cyrus immediately called security. We backed out of the space and waited in the corridor while they sent a team down. 3 security officers showed up 20 minutes later and did a sweep of the entire area. They spent 2 hours searching every crawl space, every access tunnel, every possible hiding spot in that section of the ship. They found nothing. No person, no signs of recent activity, except what we'd already discovered. The security chief told us they'd review camera footage from the crew areas and increase patrols. But his tone suggested he thought we'd stumbled onto some old forgotten space that hadn't been used in years. He didn't seem concerned about the fact that the hatch had been forced open from the inside, or that some of those food wrappers had dates on them from just 2 weeks prior. That's when things started getting strange. The next night, I was back on shift alone. Budget cuts meant they'd reduce the engine crew to single-person night shifts unless there was active maintenance happening. I was doing my rounds in the main engine room when I noticed one of my toolboxes had been moved. Not dramatically, just shifted about 3 feet from where I'd left it. I checked the contents and realized my best wrench set was missing. Industrial tools, heavy-duty stuff that you didn't just misplace. I reported it to Cyrus the next morning, and he said he'd look into it, but I could tell he was brushing it off. Over the next week, more tools disappeared. A drill, a set of bolt cutters, a heavy-duty flashlight. Each time it happened during my night shift, but I never saw or heard anyone. The engine room was incredibly loud, sure, but I'd worked there long enough to know every sound that machinery made. And I started hearing something else. Movement in the walls. Not the normal creaking and settling you get on a ship, but deliberate sounds. Scraping, footsteps on metal grating, the sound of something being dragged through the crawl spaces above the ceiling panels. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that the isolation and the weird discovery were making me paranoid. But then I found the calendar. I was inspecting a valve assembly in a section I visited every night, and there it was, scratched into the metal panel beside the valve. A crude calendar counting down days. 30 boxes arranged in rows, 29 of them crossed out with deep gouges. The last box, box 30, was circled multiple times. I checked my phone for the date. It was day 30. That calendar ended on the current date. My hands were shaking as I called Cyrus. It was 2 in the morning, but I didn't care. I told him what I'd found, and for the first time since this started, I heard actual concern in his voice. He said he'd come down immediately, and that I should move to a more open area of the engine room where I could see all the access points. I stood in the center of the main floor, surrounded by machinery, with my back to a wall. Every shadow looked wrong. Every sound made me jump. Cyrus arrived 15 minutes later, and I showed him the calendar. He photographed it with his phone, then told me something that made everything worse. 2 crew members had reported feeling like they were being watched in their cabins over the past week. Both of them were housed on deck 6. Both of their cabin numbers corresponded to X marks on those drawings we'd found. Security had dismissed the reports as paranoia, the kind of thing that happens when people live in tight quarters for months at a time. But Cyrus had looked at the reports himself after our discovery, and he'd noticed the pattern. He told me to finish my shift, but stay in the main engine room. Don't go into any of the auxiliary spaces or crawl areas. He said he was going to security and demanding they take this seriously. I agreed, but the moment he left, The main lights in the engine room flickered. Not a normal power fluctuation, but a deliberate pattern. On, off, 3 times. Then they stabilized. I looked up at the catwalk that ran along the ceiling, 20 feet above the engine floor. I saw movement. Just for a second, a shadow passing in front of one of the auxiliary lights. Someone was up there. I should have run. I should have followed Cyrus out and refused to go back. But 6 years of training kicked in, and I did the stupidest thing possible. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the ladder to the catwalk. The metal grating stretched in both directions, disappearing into darkness beyond the range of the emergency lights. I started walking, slowly, checking every junction and access point. My flashlight beam cut through the shadows, and that's when I saw it. A figure at the far end of the catwalk, maybe 60 feet away, just standing there, watching me. I froze. My flashlight was pointed right at them, but I couldn't make out details. They were wearing dark clothes, something covering their face. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds. Then they turned and disappeared through an access panel I didn't even know existed. I ran after them, my boots hammering on the metal grating. When I reached the panel, it was already sealed from the other side. I could hear movement beyond it, receding into the walls. Security came down in force after that. They did. Another sweep, this time with thermal imaging equipment and dogs. They found more evidence of habitation. 3 different crawl spaces had been set up as hiding spots, each one with supplies and those same disturbing drawings. But they never found the person. Whoever had been living in those walls had vanished. The security chief's theory was that they'd somehow gotten off the ship at our last port. But that didn't explain how they'd accessed restricted areas that required key cards, or how they'd survived in spaces where the temperature regularly hit 100 degrees. Cyrus pulled me aside the day after the major search. We were in the crew mess, and he looked exhausted. He told me something I'll never forget. He said this wasn't the first time this had happened. 5 years earlier, on a different ship in the same fleet, maintenance crews had found similar evidence of someone living in the walls. That time, they'd actually caught the person, a former crew member who'd been fired, but somehow never left the ship. He'd been living in the service tunnels for 3 months, stealing food, watching crew members through vents. The company had kept it quiet, settled with the crew members who'd been spied on, and implemented new security protocols. But clearly, those protocols weren't enough. Cyrus told me I needed to forget about what I'd seen. He said corporate had already decided how this was going to be handled. There would be increased security sweeps for the rest of the crews. The affected areas would be sealed with new locks, and the incident would be classified as a security matter, not for discussion. He said if I pushed the issue or talked about it publicly, I'd be violating my employment contract and could face legal action. Then he said something that still haunts me. He said the person I'd seen on the catwalk had been watching me for weeks, that the calendar wasn't counting down to anything specific. It was just marking how long they'd been observing. Day 30 was the day they decided to reveal themselves. I finished that contract but requested a transfer to a different ship immediately after. I spent 2 more years working cruise vessels, but I never felt safe in those engine rooms again. I'd find myself constantly looking up at the ceiling panels, listening for sounds that didn't belong. I started noticing things other crew members missed. Access panels that should have been locked standing slightly ajar. Tool marks on hatches that were supposed to be sealed. The occasional missing provision that couldn't be accounted for. The thing about cruise ships that passengers don't understand is how much empty space exists in them, Miles of corridors and crawl spaces and service tunnels that connect everything together. Spaces where someone could hide for weeks or months if they knew the layout. Spaces where you could watch people through vents and gaps in the walls, where you could move around at night while everyone slept. I've thought a lot about those X marks on the drawings, about what they meant. Were they targets, observations, threats? I'll never know. What I do know is that I wasn't the only crew member who experienced this kind of thing. After word got around about what happened, 3 other engine techs from different ships told me similar stories. Finding evidence of habitation in restricted areas, hearing movement in the walls, tools disappearing. It's more common than anyone wants to admit. The companies keep it quiet because acknowledging it would terrify passengers and crew alike. But it happens. And the people living in those walls, whether they're former crew with grudges or stowaways or something else entirely, they know those ships better than anyone. They know every hiding spot, every blind spot in the camera coverage, every way to move unseen. I left cruise work entirely in 2017. I'm a land-based engineer now, and I've never been happier to have a job where I can see the sky and know exactly who's around me. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I think about that figure on the catwalk. The way they stood so still, just watching. The way they disappeared into the walls like they'd done it 1,000 times before. And I wonder if they're still out there, on some ship in the Caribbean, living in the spaces between, marking calendars and watching crew members sleep. Have you ever worked in a place with miles of hidden spaces behind the walls? Drop a comment and let me know what you'd do if you discovered someone had been watching you for weeks without your knowledge. My name is Zaylee, and for 3 years, I performed as a vocalist in the main entertainment lounge aboard Mediterranean cruise ships. I was 26 years old when this started, living what I thought was a dream life. Getting paid to sing every night, traveling through Europe, meeting people from all over the world. The job had its challenges, sure. Long hours, demanding passengers, the constant motion of the sea. But I loved performing, and the applause made everything worthwhile. Until someone in the audience decided that watching wasn't enough. Until I learned that locked doors and security systems mean absolutely nothing when someone is determined to get close to you. It began so subtly that I almost missed it. After my 4th show of the week, I returned to my dressing room backstage and found a single red rose on my makeup table. No note, nothing identifying who left it. I assumed it was from a passenger who charmed one of the stage crew into delivering it. It happened occasionally. Performers got gifts, compliments, the occasional inappropriate advance that security handled. I put the rose in water and thought nothing more about it. 2 nights later, another rose appeared. Same placement, same type. Still no note. This time I asked the other entertainers and crew if they'd seen anyone backstage. Nobody had. Our dressing room corridor was supposed to be restricted access, crew and performers only, but the doors weren't exactly maximum security. I figured someone had slipped through during the show when everyone was distracted. The 3rd gift changed things. I arrived for my evening performance and found a small jewelry box on my table. Inside was a bracelet, delicate silver with blue stones that matched the dress I'd worn during my previous show. The detail bothered me. Whoever left this had been paying very close attention to what I wore. But what really made my stomach drop was finding the note underneath the box. It said, "You looked beautiful in the blue dress. The way the stage lights caught it during your 2nd song was perfection. I never miss a moment." The phrasing was strange, almost possessive. I never miss a moment suggested they watched every show, studied every detail. I reported it to Ronan, the head of security for the entertainment deck. Ronan was professional about it, took the note and bracelet as evidence, said he'd review camera footage from the backstage area. He told me this kind of thing happened more often than people realized. Passengers developed fixations on performers, crew members, even other passengers. Usually it was harmless, just lonely people seeking connection. He assured me they'd identify whoever was leaving the gifts and have a conversation with them about appropriate boundaries. I felt better after talking to him. I trusted security knew what they were doing. That trust lasted exactly 3 more days. The next gift appeared in my dressing room, despite Ronan having changed the door code and increased camera coverage in the backstage corridor. This time, it was photographs. Professional quality prints, dozens of them, showing me performing from angles that seemed impossible. Shots from directly above the stage, from behind the curtains, from positions in the audience that would have required expensive equipment to capture such clarity. But it was the final photo in the stack that made my hands shake. It showed me walking through a crew-only corridor on Deck 3, the one I used as a shortcut to my cabin after late shows. The angle suggested the photographer had been ahead of me, waiting, knowing exactly which route I'd take. The photo was dated from 2 nights ago. I hadn't told anyone about using that corridor. It wasn't on any passenger-accessible deck. I went straight to Ronan with the photos. I watched his expression change as he looked through them, especially that last one. He asked me detailed questions about my routines, where I went after shows, whether I'd noticed anyone following me. I told him about the corridor, about how I always used the same route because it was faster and avoided the crowded passenger areas where people sometimes waited to talk to performers. He made notes, promised to pull footage from every camera on my usual paths, and assigned an officer to escort me to and from my cabin for the next week. He also said something that stuck with me. He said the photos being taken in crew areas was a serious concern because it meant either a crew member was involved or someone had figured out how to access restricted zones. Both possibilities were deeply unsettling. The gifts continued despite the increased security. A recording of one of my phone conversations with my sister appeared in my dressing room, burned onto a CD with another note. This one said, "I love hearing your real voice, not just the performance voice. You sound happiest when you talk to her." I hadn't made that call from anywhere public. I'd been in my cabin, door locked, speaking quietly because my roommate Keela was sleeping. Someone had recorded me through the walls or somehow accessed my phone. Ronan had my phone checked by the ship's IT specialist. No spyware, no tracking apps. Nothing that explained how the conversation had been captured. Then came the photographs that made me realize this had crossed from disturbing into dangerous. I found them slipped under my cabin door one morning, arriving back from breakfast to discover an envelope that hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier. Inside were photos of me sleeping. Multiple angles, multiple nights based on the different pajamas I wore in each image. Someone had been in my cabin while I slept, standing over my bed, taking pictures. The positions of the shots suggested they'd spent significant time in there, moving around, getting different perspectives. Keela confirmed she'd never woken up, never heard anything unusual. The cabin door had a lock that required a key card. Security records showed only our 2 key cards had been used to access that room. I stopped sleeping. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing in the darkness of my cabin, watching, taking photos, being so close they could have touched me. Keela offered to switch cabins with me, try a different location. but I knew it wouldn't matter. This person, whoever they were, had demonstrated they could access any space on the ship. Locked doors meant nothing. Security measures meant nothing. I performed each night in a state of hyper-awareness, scanning the audience, looking for someone paying too much attention, watching me with an intensity that stood out. But cruise ship audiences were constantly changing. Passengers disembarked, new ones boarded, and anyone could be the person sending these gifts. Ronan brought me into his office 3 weeks into this nightmare. He'd reviewed hundreds of hours of footage from every camera on my usual routes, every corridor I used, every space I occupied regularly. Nothing. The cameras showed me walking alone, entering and exiting my cabin alone, going to my dressing room alone. There were no gaps in coverage, no moments where someone obviously followed me, no evidence of anyone accessing my cabin or dressing room outside of normal authorized entry. He'd interviewed crew members, pulled records of who had access to which areas, cross-referenced schedules with gift appearances. Every lead went nowhere. He looked exhausted, frustrated in a way that scared me because it meant even security didn't understand how this was happening. That's when he told me his theory. He thought it might be another crew member, someone with extensive knowledge of the ship's layout and security systems. Someone who knew camera blind spots, who understood crew schedules and routines, who had legitimate access to restricted areas. The idea that I worked alongside this person every day, that I might have served them food in the crew mess or passed them in a corridor, made me feel physically ill. I started avoiding communal crew areas. I ate in my cabin, took different routes to the theater for performances, changed my schedule randomly to avoid patterns. The messages escalated. Notes appeared in impossible locations. One taped to the underside of my makeup table drawer, which I'd used that morning without noticing anything. One slipped into my sheet music folder during a performance, meaning someone had accessed the stage while I was standing on it. The content of the messages shifted from admiration to ownership. You belong here, on this ship, performing for me. I've protected you from passengers who got too friendly after shows. We're connected in ways you don't understand yet. The possessive language terrified me, but that middle message was worse. It implied they'd been intervening in my life, controlling situations, watching every interaction I had with passengers. Then I received the note that made me understand the true scope of what was happening. It appeared in my dressing room before my final show of that cruise, placed prominently on my mirror where I couldn't miss it. The message was simple, just one sentence, but it shattered any remaining sense of safety I had. I can go anywhere on this ship. Doors don't stop me. Locks don't stop me. Security doesn't stop me. Nothing stops me from being close to you. Reading those words, I realized this person wasn't just accessing restricted areas through some technical knowledge or stolen keycard. They moved through the ship like they were invisible, like physical barriers didn't exist for them. Either they had capabilities far beyond what I understood, or the ship's security had vulnerabilities so severe that everything we relied on for safety was meaningless. I told Ronan I wanted off at the next port. He tried to convince me to finish the contract, said they were implementing new security protocols specifically for my situation, offered to have officers stationed outside my cabin around the clock. I refused. I'd reached my breaking point. The exhaustion from not sleeping, the constant hypervigilance, the knowledge that someone watched my every move and I couldn't identify them. It was destroying me. I could barely perform anymore. My voice cracked during songs. I forgot lyrics I'd sung hundreds of times. I walked on stage feeling hunted instead of confident. The ship docked in Barcelona on a Wednesday morning. I'd packed everything the night before, barely bringing anything because I just wanted out. Keela helped me carry my bags up to the crew exit. We were waiting in the staging area for clearance to disembark when I received one final message on my phone. An unknown number, a text that read, "You're leaving? That's disappointing. I thought we had something special. But I understand. The ship was getting crowded anyway. Your apartment back home has much better light for photographs. See you soon." My apartment. They knew where I lived. This wasn't ending with me leaving the ship. I showed Ronan the message immediately. He took my phone, documented everything, and contacted local police in Barcelona to file a report. But what could they do? No crime had technically been committed beyond harassment. No threats of violence, no physical contact, just gifts and messages and surveillance. Ronan arranged for police escort from the ship to the airport and contacted authorities in my home city to alert them about potential stalking. He looked genuinely shaken, which scared me more than anything else had. He'd worked cruise ship security for a decade and admitted he'd never encountered anything like this. I flew home that afternoon. For weeks, I barely left my apartment. I had new locks installed, a security system with cameras, motion sensors on every entrance. I changed my phone number, my email, deleted all social media. I waited for another gift to appear, another photograph, another note proving they'd followed me. Home. Nothing came. Months passed in paranoid isolation. Eventually, I started working again, teaching voice lessons from my apartment, slowly rebuilding some kind of normal life. But I never performed publicly again. The thought of standing on a stage, exposed under lights, knowing someone in the audience might be watching me with that same obsessive intensity, makes my skin crawl. The worst part is not knowing who it was, not knowing if it was a passenger who somehow had capabilities that shouldn't be possible, or a crew member who betrayed the trust we all depended on to feel safe living in those tight quarters, not knowing if they're still out there, working on another ship, fixating on another performer, refining their techniques for accessing spaces they shouldn't reach. Ronan told me later they never identified the person. The investigation went cold. The gifts stopped after I left. Like whoever it was lost interest once I was no longer trapped on that ship with them. I think about those final words in that text message sometimes. Your apartment back home has much better light for photographs. They never followed through, never appeared. But the threat lingers. The knowledge that someone studied me so completely, learned my patterns, my roots, my vulnerabilities, and demonstrated they could reach me anywhere. That kind of attention doesn't just disappear, it waits. And sometimes late at night, when I hear a noise in my apartment building or notice something slightly out of place, I wonder if they're still out there, still watching, still waiting for me to lower my guard and step back into the light where they can see me clearly again. If someone was leaving you gifts in places they shouldn't be able to access, would you trust security to handle it or get off that ship immediately? Let me know in the comments what you would do. My name is Derek, and I worked as a security officer on transatlantic cruise ships for 9 years before I finally walked away in 2012. I was 41 years old when the incident happened that made me question everything about the job I dedicated nearly a decade of my life to. People think cruise ship security is about breaking up drunk fights and finding lost passports, and sure, that's part of it. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes you become the person who has to decide what truth looks like, who has to choose between what you know happened and what your employers need to have happened. I'm going to tell you about a man who went overboard on my watch, and why I'll never believe the official explanation for how he ended up in the Atlantic Ocean at 3 in the morning. The alarm came through my radio at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. We were 4 days into a crossing from Southampton to New York, deep in the middle of the Atlantic where the water is black and endless and completely unforgiving. Man overboard, starboard side, deck 11. I was already moving before the announcement finished, grabbing my equipment bag and sprinting for the nearest stairwell. Man overboard protocol is drilled into every crew member from day one. You have minutes, maybe, before hypothermia sets in, even less if the person is injured. The ship was already beginning its turn, engines reversing, the whole massive vessel shuddering as it fought against its own momentum to circle back. I reached deck 11 in under 3 minutes. Another officer named Cohen had beaten me there and was already taking a statement from the passenger who'd called it in. The witness was a woman in her 60s, wrapped in a bathrobe, shaking but coherent. She told us she'd been unable to sleep and had come out to the deck for fresh air. She'd been standing at the port side rail when she heard voices from the starboard side, around the curve of the deck. Raised voices, she said. 2 men arguing. Then she heard a shout, cut off suddenly, and a splash. She'd run around to the starboard side and seen the water disturbed below, white foam catching the deck lights. But no person. Nobody in the water, nobody at the rail. Just empty deck and that churning water far below, where something had clearly just entered the ocean. Cohen was getting her cabin number and contact information when she said something that made me stop reviewing the deck layout on my tablet. She said she was certain she'd heard 2 voices arguing, and that the shout had sounded wrong. Not like someone jumping, she insisted, but like someone surprised, like they hadn't expected to go over. She kept using the word pushed. "I think he was pushed," she said 3 times while we were there. I didn't see it happen, but I heard it. And something about those voices, the way the shout cut off, it wasn't right. Cohen nodded and wrote it down, but I could see in his expression what I was thinking. Witness testimony in the middle of the night, from around a blind corner, hearing something but seeing nothing. Not exactly reliable evidence. The Coast Guard was notified immediately, standard protocol. We provided coordinates, description of what little we knew, and continued the search pattern. Spotlights swept the water. Crew members lined the rails scanning for any sign of a person. I went to the security office to review camera footage while the search continued. We had cameras covering most deck areas, including deck 11 starboard where this supposedly happened. I pulled up the feed and started reviewing the timeline. At 3:14 a.m., the footage showed a man at the rail, alone. He was wearing dark pants and a light-colored shirt, leaning against the rail, looking out at the water. I couldn't see his face from the camera angle, but his posture seemed relaxed, casual, not distressed, not arguing with anyone. At 3:15 and 12 seconds, he was still there, same position. Then the footage glitched. 4 seconds of static, just gray noise across the screen. When the feed came back at 3:15 and 16 seconds, the rail was empty. Nobody visible in frame. The man was gone. 4 seconds. In 4 seconds, someone could go over a rail, yes. But where was the second person the witness heard? Where was the argument? I rewound and watched it again. Man at rail, static, empty rail. I checked the other cameras that covered approaches to that section of deck 11. Nothing showed anyone else in the area during the relevant time frame. According to the footage, that man had been completely alone. I spent the next hour pulling up incident reports from the ship's database while the search continued outside. We had protocols for accessing historical records, and something about this was nagging at me. I started searching for any previous man overboard incidents on this specific vessel. What I found made my stomach tighten. 3 other passengers had gone overboard during the current year, 3 separate incidents, spread across different voyages. I pulled up the details on each one. The first incident happened in February, when a male passenger, 34 years old, went overboard from deck 11 starboard side at 3:30 in the morning. It was ruled an accidental death with possible suicide, and there were no witnesses. The second incident occurred in May, involving a female passenger, 52 years old. Same deck 11 starboard location at 2:45 a.m. Again ruled accidental death or possible suicide, with one witness who heard a splash but saw nothing. The third happened in August, a male passenger aged 28, deck 11 starboard side at 3:20 a.m., ruled accidental with no witnesses present. I sat back and stared at the screen. Same ship, same deck, same general rail section, all in the middle of the night, all ruled accidents or suicides. I dug deeper into the files, looking for any commonalities. The February victim had been traveling with a friend who disembarked at the next port and cut his trip short. The May victim had been traveling alone. The August victim had been sharing a cabin with another passenger who'd also left the ship at the next port, citing a family emergency. I called Cohen into the office and showed him what I'd found. He studied the screen for a long time before speaking. He said he'd worked this ship for 2 years and had never noticed the pattern because the incidents were months apart and he'd never had reason to review them all together. But seeing them lined up like this, same location, same time frame, similar circumstances, it looked wrong. He asked if I'd noticed anything else connecting them. I told him about the roommates or travel companions leaving early after the incidents. He pulled up the current victim's information. The man who'd gone overboard was named Grant, 36 years old, traveling from the UK to New York. He was sharing a cabin with another passenger, cabin 8142. I felt cold looking at that information. Another shared cabin, another companion who would now be questioned about what happened. We went to wake the cabin mate for questioning. It was part of protocol, and we needed to inform him about his roommate regardless. Cabin 8142 didn't answer our knocks. I used my security override to open the door. The cabin was empty, not just unoccupied, but empty. The second bed looked like it had never been slept in. No personal items visible, nothing in the closet space. The cabin mate's belongings were gone. I checked the manifest system on my phone. It showed both passengers as active, both having boarded in Southampton. But only one set of luggage had been stored according to the records. Only Grant's items were registered. His supposed companion had boarded with him, but brought nothing, left no trace, and was now nowhere on the ship. We initiated a ship-wide search for the missing companion, while simultaneously checking every camera we had. Nothing. The man appeared on boarding footage getting on the ship with Grant 5 days earlier. Then nothing. 5 days of footage, and he never appeared again. Not in dining areas, not in public spaces, not anywhere. It was like he'd vanished the moment he stepped onto the vessel. Until presumably tonight, when maybe he'd been on deck 11 arguing with Grant before Grant went over that rail. I brought everything to my supervisor that morning. The pattern of incidents, the camera glitches, the missing companion, the witness testimony about hearing 2 people arguing. I laid it all out and said we needed to contact authorities beyond the Coast Guard. This looked like something more than accidents or suicides. My supervisor listened, reviewed everything I'd compiled, and then told me to file my report and let management handle it from there. Management's response came down by noon. The incident was being ruled an accidental man overboard, likely a passenger who'd had too much to drink and leaned too far over the rail. The camera glitch was a known technical issue they were working to resolve. The missing companion was actually a booking error. Someone who'd canceled last minute, but hadn't been properly removed from the manifest. The previous incidents I'd flagged were unrelated tragedies that happened to occur on the same general area of a very large ship. There was no pattern. There was no conspiracy. There was just a very unfortunate accident and a grieving family who would be notified and compensated according to company policy. I tried to push back. I pointed out the impossibilities in their explanation. How do you have a booking error for someone who appears on boarding footage? How do you explain 3 other incidents in the exact same location with the exact same camera issues? How do you dismiss witness testimony about hearing 2 people when it's the only direct account we have of what happened? My supervisor told me, quietly and with something like sympathy in his voice, that I needed to understand how these things worked. The ship was carrying 3,000 passengers and operating on tight schedules with port authorities in multiple countries. A death at sea triggered investigations, delays, negative publicity, massive insurance complications. If there was any possibility of ruling something accidental rather than suspicious, management would take that option every single time. He told me the Coast Guard had been given all relevant information and had accepted the accidental death ruling. The search had been called off after 6 hours when it became clear nobody could survive that long in the water. Grant's family would be notified. The cruise would continue. We would dock in New York on schedule. And I would file my security report using the language management had provided, focusing on the unfortunate accident and the immediate response protocols that had been followed correctly. I spent 3 days wrestling with what to do. I had copies of everything I'd compiled. The incident patterns, the camera footage showing the glitch, the witness statements. I could go to media, to law enforcement, to anyone who might listen. But I also had a contract with clauses about confidentiality and company loyalty. I had a career I'd built over 9 years. I had a mortgage and bills and responsibilities. And I had the memory of my supervisor's face when he'd told me how these things worked, the resignation in his voice that said he'd been through this exact situation before. I looked up the previous victims online. Grant had a family, a job in marketing, friends posting tributes on social media. The February victim had been a teacher. The May victim had run a small bakery. The August victim had been a graduate student. Real people with real lives, all of whom had ended up in the ocean in the middle of the night on the same section of deck on the same ship. And all of their deaths had been explained away with the same corporate efficiency that was now processing Grant's incident. I filed my report using management's language. I completed the rest of that crossing and the one after it. I put in my resignation at the end of my contract and walked away from cruise work entirely. I told myself I'd tried, that I'd reported everything I could through proper channels, that there was nothing more I could have done without destroying my own life. But the truth is, I made a choice. I chose to stay silent because speaking up would have cost me more than I was willing to pay. That was 12 years ago, and I still think about it constantly. About Grant and the 3 others before him. About the missing companion who appeared on boarding footage, but never existed according to official records. About those camera glitches that always seemed to happen at exactly the wrong moment. About the witness who heard 2 voices arguing and a surprised shout. I think about all the other security officers on all the other ships. And I wonder how many of them have seen patterns they couldn't explain and made the same choice I did. The thing about working security on a cruise ship is that you're not really there to protect passengers from danger. You're there to manage incidents in ways that minimize disruption and liability for the company. When those 2 priorities conflict, when protecting passengers means investigating something corporate doesn't want investigated, you find out real quick which priority actually matters. I found out, and I walked away. And I've carried the weight of that decision every day since. I don't know what really happened on Deck 11 that night. Maybe Grant really did accidentally fall. Maybe the camera glitch was coincidence. Maybe there's an innocent explanation for everything I saw that I'm just not smart enough to understand. But I don't believe that. I believe something was happening on that ship, something that had happened before and probably happened after I left. I believe Grant's companion was real and was there and pushed him over that rail. And I believe management knew more than they were saying, that they'd seen this pattern too, and made a calculated decision that 4 mysterious deaths were an acceptable cost of doing business if it meant avoiding the alternative. If you discovered a pattern of deaths that your employer wanted covered up, would you risk everything to expose it, or would you protect yourself and walk away? Tell me what you think you'd really do in the comments. My name is Nash, and I spent 2 years working as a kitchen prep worker on cruise ships that ran Asian routes before I finally requested a transfer to day shifts and eventually quit altogether. I was 23 when this started happening, young enough that I still needed the money badly enough to work the overnight shifts nobody else wanted. The pay differential for night work was decent, and honestly, I preferred the quiet. No head chefs yelling, no rush of meal service, just me and a few other crew members preparing ingredients for the breakfast and lunch rushes while the rest of the ship slept. It seemed like an easy job until I started hearing the voices coming from the walk-in freezer. And then nothing about those nights felt easy anymore. The crew mess kitchen where I worked was located deep in the ship, nowhere near the passenger dining areas. This was where crew meals got prepared, where we did our bulk prep work, where the serious cooking happened away from the fancy presentations passengers saw upstairs. It was all industrial equipment, stainless steel surfaces, and that constant hum of refrigeration units keeping tons of food at safe temperatures. During the day, it was chaos. 30 crew members moving through tight spaces, multiple stations operating simultaneously, the clash of pans and the shouting of orders in 6 different languages. But at night, specifically from midnight to 6 a.m. when I worked, it was almost peaceful. Just the mechanical sounds of the ship and whatever podcast or music you had playing in your earbuds while you chopped vegetables or portioned proteins for the next day. The walk-in freezer was at the back of the kitchen, a massive unit that could hold 2 weeks' worth of frozen provisions. Heavy insulated door, bright fluorescent lights inside, metal shelving units packed with everything from ice cream to frozen seafood. I went in and out of it dozens of times each shift, grabbing whatever ingredients I needed, restocking items, doing inventory counts. It was cold, obviously, but I'd gotten used to it. You learned to work fast, get what you needed, and get out before the temperature really started affecting your hands. Nothing unusual about it at all until about 3 months into my time on that ship. I was working alone in the main prep area around 2 in the morning, breaking down a case of chicken for the lunch service. The freezer was maybe 30 feet behind me, door closed like always. My earbuds were in, but the music was low because I needed to stay alert for any equipment issues or if someone came looking for me. That's when I heard it. Voices. Clear as anything, multiple people talking coming from the direction of the freezer. I pulled out my earbuds and listened. The voices continued. Conversation, back and forth. Too muffled for me to make out words, but definitely human voices. Multiple people having what sounded like a casual discussion inside the freezer. My first thought was that someone else from the night crew had gone in there and maybe was on a phone call, though that seemed weird given the temperature. I walked over to the freezer and put my hand on the door. I could feel the vibration of the voices through the metal, which made no sense because sound shouldn't carry like that through 6 inches of insulation. I pulled the heavy door open. The freezer was empty, completely empty. Just shelves of frozen food and that blast of cold air and the hum of the cooling system. No people, no phones, no speakers. Nothing that could produce the voices I'd clearly heard. I stood there for a minute, confused, then closed the door and went back to work. I convinced myself I'd heard something from elsewhere in the ship, sound traveling through ventilation or pipes in weird ways. These vessels were enormous, complex structures where noises could bounce around in unexpected patterns. I finished my shift and didn't think much more about it. But 3 nights later, it happened again. Same time, around 2 a.m. Same location, the freezer. This time the voices were louder, not yelling, but clearer, like the volume had been turned up. I could almost make out words. And then I heard something that made my blood go cold. Laughter. Multiple people laughing together, the sound echoing from inside that freezer. I approached the door more carefully this time. The voices continued as I got closer, and I realized I could hear individual tones now. Men and women both, at least 4 or 5 different voices, all talking over each other like a group of friends at a party. I yanked the door open fast, trying to catch whoever was in there. Empty again. But this time, something else happened. The moment the door opened, the voices stopped instantly. Not trailing off, not fading out, but cutting off mid-sentence like someone had hit a kill switch. And the temperature drop I felt was worse than normal. Even for a freezer, the cold that hit me felt wrong. Deeper somehow. Like it was pulling heat from my body faster than it should. I started asking around among the other night crew. There was a woman named Pearl who worked the baking station, preparing bread and pastries for the next day. She'd been on night shifts for over a year. When I mentioned the freezer and the voices, her expression changed immediately. She pulled me aside, away from where others could hear, and told me she'd experienced the exact same thing. Multiple times over the past 6 months. She'd heard conversations, laughter, sometimes what sounded like arguments. She'd opened that door dozens of times expecting to find people inside, and it was always empty. She'd reported it to the head chef once, and he'd looked at her like she was losing it, told her night shifts could mess with your head and maybe she should request a schedule change. Pearl said she'd learned to just ignore it. She'd hear the voices, acknowledge them mentally, and keep working. She said the worst thing you could do was engage with it, try to figure it out. Because that's when it got into your head and wouldn't leave. But she also told me something else. She said 2 other night workers had experienced it before her. One had quit after a month, refusing to explain why. The other had requested a transfer to a different ship. Both had worked the exact shift I was working now, the midnight to 6 a.m. slot in the crew mess kitchen. Pearl made it sound like this was just something that happened, an accepted reality of working that shift in that space, and you either dealt with it or you left. I tried to deal with it. For the next few weeks, every time I heard the voices, I'd acknowledge them and keep working. Just background noise, I told myself, some weird acoustic phenomenon I didn't understand. But it kept getting worse. The voices became more frequent, sometimes happening multiple times in a single shift. And they started changing. Instead of generic conversation, I began hearing specific things, phrases that sounded familiar, conversations I'd had with Pearl earlier in the shift, played back to me word for word from inside the freezer. My own voice, discussing what prep work still needed to be finished, having a dialogue with Pearl's voice, both of us clearly audible inside that freezer, even though we were both standing in the main kitchen. That's when the fear really set in. Hearing random voices was one thing, but hearing my own voice coming from inside the freezer, having conversations that had happened an hour earlier, that crossed a line into something I couldn't rationalize. I told Pearl about it, and she went pale. She admitted the same thing had started happening to her recently. Her own voice, conversations she'd had with other crew members during breaks, all of it replayed from inside the freezer at random times throughout the night. She said it had been getting progressively worse over the past month, and she was considering requesting a transfer herself. We tried to investigate. During a night when we were both on shift and had finished most of our prep work early, we decided to actually spend time near the freezer and document what happened. We set up a phone to record audio, positioned it near the freezer door, and waited. Around 2:15 a.m., the voices started. Clear as ever, multiple people talking, and this time we both recognized the voices immediately. It was us, Pearl and me, having the exact conversation we'd had during our dinner break 4 hours earlier. Word for word, tone for tone. Perfect reproduction of a private conversation that had happened in the crew mess dining area on a completely different deck. Pearl grabbed the phone to check if it was somehow playing back audio it had recorded. But the phone showed it was only recording, not playing anything. The voices were coming from the freezer itself. We stood there listening to ourselves discuss our families back home, our plans after this contract ended, personal details we definitely hadn't shared with anyone else. When the playback ended, there was silence for maybe 10 seconds. Then we heard something new. My own voice, saying words I'd never spoken. It was talking about the freezer, saying we should stop investigating, that some things on ships were better left alone, that curiosity led to people leaving in the middle of contracts. It sounded exactly like me. Same inflections, same speech patterns, but saying things I'd never said. Pearl refused to go near the freezer after that. She'd send me to get frozen items when she needed them, and I couldn't blame her. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd heard. My voice, saying things I hadn't said. That implied whatever was happening in the freezer wasn't just playing back sounds, it was creating them, using our voices to generate new content. The implications of that were terrifying. What else could it create? What else had it been saying in our voices when we weren't there to hear it? I started researching the ship's history during my off hours. It was an older vessel, built in the early 90s, that had been through several refits and renovations. I found references in old crew forums to weird experiences in the lower decks, though nothing specific about the crew mess kitchen. But I did find something interesting in the ship's technical documentation, which I accessed through a friend who worked in engineering. The crew mess freezer had been installed during a major renovation in 2008. Before that, the same space had been used for something else. The documents weren't entirely clear, but cross-referencing old deck plans, it looked like that area had previously been a morgue storage room, back when the ship had been configured differently. Ships have morgues. Most passengers don't know this, but any vessel that size needs a place to store bodies when people die during voyages, which happens more often than anyone wants to discuss. Usually, it's a small refrigerated space, nothing elaborate, just cold storage to preserve remains until the ship reaches port. The fact that our walk-in freezer had been built over or converted from morgue space seemed significant. I brought this information to Pearl, and she looked sick. She said we needed to tell someone in authority, that this was beyond just weird sounds and needed to be addressed properly. We went to the ship's maintenance supervisor with everything. The voices, the playback of our conversations, the history of the space, all of it. He listened politely, took notes, and said he'd have engineering check the freezer's systems for any electrical issues that might cause interference or strange sounds. A week later, engineering reported they'd found nothing wrong. All systems operating normally, no electrical anomalies, no explanation for what we'd described. The supervisor suggested, kindly but firmly, that night shift isolation could produce auditory hallucinations, especially in younger crew members who weren't used to the work patterns. He recommended we consider requesting day shifts or speaking with the ship's medical staff if the experiences continued. Nobody was taking us seriously, and I understood why. We sounded insane. Hearing voices from a freezer, voices that played back our own conversations and created new ones using our speech patterns. Without recording evidence that captured the phenomenon, and our phone recordings had all come out as just ambient kitchen noise, we had nothing concrete to show. Just our testimony, which apparently wasn't enough. The experiences continued for the remaining 2 months of my contract. The voices never stopped. They just became part of the routine. Some nights they were quiet, barely noticeable. Other nights they were constant, full conversations and laughter and occasionally screaming, though I tried not to think too hard about the screaming. Pearl and I developed an unspoken agreement not to discuss it anymore. We'd hear our voices coming from the freezer, acknowledge it with a glance at each other, and keep working. What else could we do? The thing that finally made me request a transfer happened during my last week on that ship. I was alone in the kitchen. Pearl had called in sick. It was around 2:30 a.m., and I needed to grab frozen shrimp for prep. I approached the freezer, already hearing voices inside. My own voice discussing something I couldn't quite make out. I opened the door and stepped inside to get the shrimp. The voices stopped, but as I was reaching for the shelf, I heard something behind me. Footsteps on the metal floor. I spun around. Nobody there. The door was still open, bright kitchen lights visible beyond it. But I'd clearly heard footsteps, and I felt a presence. That unmistakable sensation of someone standing close behind you. I grabbed the shrimp and basically ran out of the freezer, not bothering to close the door properly, just getting distance between me and whatever was in there. I finished that shift, but put in my transfer request the next day. I told the crew manager I needed day shifts for personal reasons, family situation back home, whatever excuse seemed least likely to raise questions. The transfer went through, and I spent my last 3 months on that ship working lunch and dinner prep, never setting foot in the crew mess kitchen after dark again. Pearl transferred off the ship entirely at the next port. I heard through the crew gossip network that she'd taken a job with a different cruise line, something about needing a change of environment. I still think about that freezer sometimes, about what we heard and what might have been happening that we didn't understand. I think about the morgue that used to occupy that space, about how many bodies might have been stored there over the years before it got converted. I think about refrigeration, about preservation, about cold stopping decay. And I wonder if sound can be preserved the same way, if conversations and moments can get trapped in cold spaces and replay endlessly, building on themselves, learning to mimic and create. I don't have answers. I just know I'll never work a night shift in a ship's kitchen again, and I'll never trust a walk-in freezer to be just a walk-in freezer. If you worked night shifts and started hearing your own voice coming from a freezer, having conversations you never had, would you investigate further or get out immediately? Drop your answer in the comments. My name is Aaron, And I worked as a senior cabin steward on Alaskan cruise routes for 8 years before what happened in 2017 made me reconsider everything I thought I understood about death and what comes after. I was 38 at the time, experienced enough that very little surprised me anymore. I'd seen passengers at their best and worst, dealt with medical emergencies, cleaned up situations I'd rather forget, and maintained professional composure through it all. Death aboard ships wasn't unusual, especially on Alaskan routes that attracted older travelers wanting to see glaciers and wildlife before they couldn't travel anymore. We had protocols, procedures, ways of handling it that kept everything quiet and efficient. But protocols don't account for what happens when someone dies and then refuses to actually leave. The passenger's name was on the manifest as occupying cabin 7322, traveling alone on a 14-day round trip from Seattle. She'd boarded without any issues, a woman in her early 70s, polite during the initial safety briefing, no special requests or medical concerns noted in her file. I'd checked on her cabin the second day as part of my regular rounds, standard turn-down service and towel replacement. She'd answered the door wearing a purple cardigan, thanked me for the fresh towels, mentioned she was enjoying the views. Normal interaction, nothing memorable except that cardigan stuck in my mind because it was a specific shade of purple, kind of lavender, but deeper, with pearl buttons down the front. 3 days into the cruise, another steward named Callan knocked on my door around 6 in the morning. He worked the deck below mine and looked upset. He told me we had a situation in 7322, medical response had been called, and the senior steward on duty needed to be present. I got dressed and headed up immediately. When I arrived, medical staff were already in the cabin. The passenger had died in her sleep, apparently peacefully. Natural causes, according to the doctor who examined her. Heart failure, not uncommon for her age, nothing suspicious or traumatic. Just an elderly woman who'd gone to sleep and didn't wake up. The next several hours followed standard death at sea protocol. Family notification through our main office, documentation of all her belongings, body prepared for storage in the morgue we maintained in the lower decks. The cabin got marked as unavailable in the system, and we were instructed to do a complete cleaning and turnover for the next port when new passengers would board. I'd been through this procedure maybe a dozen times over my years at sea, and while it was never pleasant, it was straightforward. You treated the deceased with respect, maintained privacy for the situation, and the cruise continued. Passengers rarely even knew when someone died aboard, which was intentional. Nobody wants to think about mortality while on vacation. We continued sailing 4 more days until we reached our next turnaround port. The cabin stayed empty and locked during that time. But on the second night after the woman's death, I got a call from guest services around 11 p.m. A passenger on deck 8 had reported something strange. She'd been walking back to her cabin from the late show when she encountered an elderly woman in a purple cardigan, wandering the corridor and appearing confused. The passenger had asked if she needed help, and the woman had said she was looking for her cabin, 7322. When the helpful passenger offered to walk her there, the woman had started down the corridor ahead of her. The passenger followed, but when she turned the corner, the hallway was empty. The elderly woman had simply vanished. Guest services took the report, but assumed it was a case of mistaken cabin numbers or a passenger who'd had too much to drink seeing things. They asked me to check if we had any elderly solo female passengers in purple cardigans currently aboard. I pulled up the manifest, and aside from the deceased woman, nobody matched that description. I mentioned the deceased had been wearing a purple cardigan when I'd met her, and guest services went quiet on the phone. Then they told me to note it in the system, but dismissed it as coincidence. Lots of older women wore cardigans, The passenger who'd reported it had probably seen someone else and gotten confused about details. 2 nights later, it happened again. Different passenger, different deck, same description. Elderly woman, purple cardigan with pearl buttons, looking confused and asking for cabin 7322. This passenger was a man in his 40s who'd been out on deck 9 getting air before bed. He'd seen the woman standing at the end of a corridor that dead-ended at a maintenance door. When he'd called out to ask if she needed assistance, she turned to look at him, and he said her expression was so lost and sad that he'd immediately started walking toward her. But in the time it took him to cover maybe 20 feet, she was gone. He checked the maintenance door, which was locked and required crew access. No way she could have gone through it. He'd looked in both directions along the connecting corridors. Nothing. She'd disappeared. When I heard about this second sighting, I felt cold. Same specific details, same cabin number, same desperate confusion. I went to Dallas, who managed our housekeeping department, and told him what was happening. Dallas had worked ships for 20 years and had seen pretty much everything. He listened to both incident reports and got very quiet. Then he told me something he'd never mentioned before. On a different ship 5 years earlier, they'd had a passenger die mid-cruise, and afterward, crew members had reported seeing that passenger in various locations around the vessel, always in the same clothing they died in, always appearing lost or distressed, always vanishing when approached. The sightings had continued for the remainder of that cruise, stopped when the ship docked and the body was removed, then never happened again. Dallas said there were theories among long-term crew about these occurrences. Some believed the recently deceased sometimes lingered aboard, disoriented by dying while surrounded by strangers far from home. Others thought it was psychological, mass suggestion feeding into people's grief and imagination. Dallas personally didn't know what to believe, but he'd learned that reporting these sightings to management was pointless. They'd either dismiss you as superstitious or make note that you might be psychologically unfit for sea duty. Better to just wait it out and let the situation resolve itself when the ship reached port. But the sightings didn't stay confined to passengers. On the 4th night after the woman's death, I saw her myself. I was doing late rounds, checking that all my assigned cabins were secure for the night, when I walked past the entrance to the theater on deck 5. The theater was dark, closed until morning. But as I passed the entrance, I glanced inside out of habit. Someone was sitting in the audience seating, about 10 rows back, center section. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I could make out an elderly woman in what looked like a purple cardigan. She was sitting completely still, staring at the empty stage. I stopped walking. Protocol said the theater should be empty and locked. I called out, identifying myself as crew and asking if she needed help finding her cabin. The woman didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all. I stepped into the theater, getting closer, and that's when the temperature dropped noticeably. I could feel the cold radiating from where she sat, like she was generating a field of freezing air around herself. I called out again, now only about 5 rows away from her. This time she turned her head to look at me. I recognized her face. It was the passenger from 7322, no question. Same features, same hairstyle, same cardigan I'd noticed during our brief interaction days before she died. But her expression was different from any living person I'd ever seen. Not threatening or scary in a horror movie way, just profoundly sad. Lost. Like she was aware something was wrong but couldn't understand what or how to fix it. We made eye contact for maybe 3 seconds. Then she simply wasn't there anymore. The seat was empty. The cold dissipated. I was standing alone in a dark theater with my heart hammering and no rational explanation for what I'd just witnessed. I left immediately and went straight to Dallas's office. He was reviewing schedules for the next day's port stop, and I must have looked shaken because he made me sit down before I said anything. I described what I'd seen, the exact location, the details, the way she'd vanished. Dallas rubbed his face and told me there had been 3 more passenger reports that day, all describing the same woman, same purple cardigan, same confused demeanor. She'd been seen in the library, in a public corridor on deck 6, and standing outside cabin 7322 itself, apparently trying the door handle. Every sighting followed the same pattern. Someone would spot her, try to help, and she'd disappear. The staff started talking about it despite Dallas's warnings. Word spread through crew quarters that we had a ghost aboard, that the woman who died hadn't moved on. Some crew members refused to work certain areas of the ship alone. Others dismissed it as mass hysteria or elaborate pranks. I was somewhere in the middle, knowing what I'd seen but struggling to accept the implications. I'd never believed in ghosts, considered myself rational and grounded, but I couldn't explain away the direct experience of watching someone disappear while I was looking right at them. The sightings continued through the remaining 6 days of the cruise. She appeared in different locations, always alone, always in that purple cardigan, always with that lost expression. A cocktail server saw her standing at the rail on deck 10 at midnight, staring out at the dark ocean. A maintenance worker encountered her in a crew corridor near the laundry facilities at 4 a.m. Each time she'd vanish within seconds of being approached or called to. The pattern never varied. She was searching for something. Maybe her cabin. Maybe understanding of what had happened to her. Maybe a way off the ship that no longer existed for her. The strangest sighting came 2 days before we reached port. I was in the crew mess during my break, eating a late dinner with Callan and discussing the situation. We were debating whether these sightings were real or some kind of collective delusion, when another crew member came over and asked if we'd heard about the dock incident. Apparently, a passenger had reported seeing an elderly woman in a purple cardigan standing on the dock at our current port, watching as the ship prepared to depart. The passenger had specifically noticed her because she looked distressed and kept waving toward the ship like she was trying to get someone's attention. Security had checked, but there was no one matching that description on the dock. Just empty space where the passenger swore someone had been standing moments before. That report bothered me more than the shipboard sightings. If she was appearing on land, at the docks we visited, that suggested whatever was happening wasn't confined to the vessel. She was somehow attached to the route, or to us, or to something I couldn't begin to understand. Callan thought it meant she was trying to get off the ship, desperate to reach land, but unable to actually leave. Dallas thought it was proof the sightings were psychological, that if multiple people were seeing her in multiple impossible locations, we were dealing with suggestion and pattern recognition, not anything supernatural. On the final day of the cruise, the morning we returned to Seattle, the sightings stopped completely. I checked with everyone I knew on the crew. Nobody reported seeing her after we docked. It was like whatever presence had been with us for those 11 days recognized that the journey had ended and finally let go. The body was removed through proper channels, family arrangements were made, and the cabin was thoroughly cleaned and returned to active rotation. I worked 3 more cruises on that same ship, and cabin 7322 never had any issues. No more sightings, no cold spots, no confused elderly women appearing in corridors. But I couldn't forget it. I couldn't rationalize away what I'd seen in that theater, the way she'd looked at me with such profound sadness before disappearing. I started researching death at sea, cultural beliefs about dying away from home, anything that might provide context. I found plenty of maritime folklore about ghosts and spirits, stories from sailors going back centuries about the dead lingering on ships. But I also found modern accounts from other crew members, posts on forums and social media, describing experiences nearly identical to mine. Passengers dying mid-cruise and then being seen afterward, always appearing lost, always in the clothing they died in, always vanishing when approached. The rational part of my brain wants to believe Dallas was right, that these sightings were psychological phenomena, grief and suggestion and pattern recognition, creating experiences that felt real but weren't. The part of me that stood in that theater and watched someone disappear while making eye contact knows better. I don't understand what happens when people die far from home, surrounded by strangers, on vessels moving across empty ocean. But I believe something does happen, that some part of them struggles to understand their new state, searches for familiar places or people, and takes time to accept that they need to move on. I left cruise work entirely in 2019, not because of this incident specifically, but because 8 years at sea was enough for me. I work in hospitality management on land now, and I'm grateful every day for solid ground and buildings that stay in one place. But sometimes, I think about that woman in the purple cardigan, about how she spent her final days watching glaciers and wildlife from the deck of a ship, alone but hopefully content. And I think about those 11 days after her death when she seemed to realize something was wrong. Tried to find her cabin, tried to get off the ship, tried to make sense of a situation that no longer included her physical presence. I hope she found peace eventually, that whatever kept her lingering finally released her to wherever we go when we truly leave. If you saw someone appear and disappear right in front of you with no possible explanation, would it change what you believe about life after death? Tell me in the comments what you think really happens. My name is Omar, and for 3 years, I worked as a bartender in the crew-only bar on Caribbean cruise ships. I was 31 in 2016 when something happened that made me understand just how powerless crew members really are when passengers have money and management has priorities that don't include our safety. This isn't a story about ghosts or unexplained phenomena. This is about something worse, something human, something that everyone aboard knew about, but nobody was willing to stop. I'm going to tell you about a passenger in Suite 418 and the warning I received that should have been enough to protect me, but wasn't. The crew bar was my domain, a small space tucked away on Deck 2 where staff could decompress after shifts. No passengers allowed, just crew drinking cheap beer and blowing off steam after 14-hour workdays. I knew everyone who came through those doors, knew their drink preferences, knew their problems, knew when to listen and when to just pour another round and stay quiet. It was a good job by cruise ship standards. I wasn't dealing with entitled passengers or getting screamed at by chefs. Just taking care of people who did the real work that kept these floating cities operating. Simon had been working ships for almost 15 years when we sailed together. He was maybe 45, one of those career crew members who'd worked every position imaginable and had settled into a role managing entertainment logistics. Everyone knew Simon. Everyone liked him. He was the guy who'd cover your shift if you were sick, who'd sneak you extra food from the buffet when you'd missed dinner, who knew every shortcut and workaround for the bureaucratic nightmare that was cruise ship employment. We'd talked plenty of times at the bar, casual friendship built on shared experiences and mutual respect for surviving life at sea. So when Simon pulled me aside one night after my shift ended and asked if we could talk privately, I figured he needed advice about something personal or wanted to vent about management. We went to a quiet section of the crew deck where smokers usually gathered, empty at that hour. Simon looked uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. He kept glancing around like he was worried about being overheard. Then he asked me a question that seemed to come out of nowhere. He asked if I'd received any requests from Suite 418 yet. I told him no, not specifically. Suite-level passengers sometimes requested crew bar access for private events, though it was rare and usually denied since the space was designated for staff only. Simon shook his head and said that wasn't what he meant. He said the passenger in Suite 418 had a pattern, a history, and I needed to know about it before I got pulled into a situation I couldn't escape. The way he said it made my stomach drop. He wasn't being dramatic or exaggerating. He was genuinely worried, and Simon wasn't someone who worried easily. He told me the passenger was a repeat customer, sailed with the company multiple times per year, always booked suites, always received VIP treatment from management. And this passenger had a specific type of request that came through certain channels. Suite service, private bartending, personal attention from crew members who fit a particular profile. Young, male, working positions that brought them into contact with passengers regularly. Simon said he'd been requested by name 2 years ago, asked to provide private bartending service in the suite during a voyage. Management had insisted it was a privilege, that suite passengers paid premium prices and deserved exceptional service, that refusing would reflect poorly on his employment record. Simon went to the suite. He didn't tell me exactly what happened there, and I didn't push for details because his expression made it clear he wasn't going to elaborate. But he said he'd never reported it, never filed a complaint, because he knew how these things worked. Passenger word against crew word, especially when the passenger had money and status and the crew member was replaceable and expendable. He said he'd tried to warn the next person who got requested, a younger crew member working in guest services. That person hadn't listened, had gone to the suite for what was supposed to be a consultation about onboard entertainment options, and left the ship at the next port without finishing the contract. No explanation given, no forwarding information, just gone. There had been 3 others after that, according to Simon. 3 crew members over the past 2 years who'd been specifically requested by the passenger in Suite 418, who'd provided whatever service management insisted they provide, and who'd all left shortly afterward. 2 transferred to different ships mid-contract, taking pay cuts and losing benefits to get away. 1 quit entirely, walked off at port, and never worked cruise ships again. Simon said he'd tried warning each of them, but the pressure from management was intense. The implied threat to employment was clear, and most crew members couldn't afford to refuse. He told me I needed to be prepared because based on the passenger's pattern, I fit the profile and would likely be requested soon. He said when it happened, when management approached me with their friendly insistence that I provide exceptional service to this valued guest, I needed to refuse. Find any excuse, claim illness, injury, family emergency, anything that got me out of going to that suite alone. He said he was telling me this because he'd failed to protect the others, had watched them walk into something he knew was dangerous, and couldn't live with staying silent anymore. I asked Simon why he didn't report this to port authorities, to law enforcement, to anyone with actual power to investigate. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. He said crew members were foreign nationals on vessels registered in countries with minimal labor protections, serving passengers from places where money bought silence and complicity. Who would we report to? The company that employed us and valued passenger satisfaction above everything. The port authorities who had no jurisdiction over what happened at sea. The passenger's home country where we had no standing and no resources to pursue justice. Simon said the system was designed to protect passengers and profit, in that order. And crew concerns ranked somewhere below maintenance schedules and fuel costs. He said he'd seen worse things covered up over his years at sea, had watched the machine grind through people and spit them out. And the best you could do was try to protect the next person in line. That's what he was doing for me, giving me information the others hadn't had, a chance to avoid what they'd experienced. 3 days later, I got called to the crew manager's office. Avery, who handled crew scheduling and assignments, greeted me with a huge smile and said I'd been personally requested by a suite passenger to provide private bartending service. The passenger specifically asked for me by name, had apparently seen me working in the crew bar during a rare tour some VIPs had been given of crew facilities, and thought I'd be perfect for a small gathering they were planning. Avery made it sound like an incredible opportunity, a chance to make excellent tips, to provide the kind of personalized service that got you noticed for promotions and better assignments. I felt sick listening to it. Suite 418, exactly as Simon had warned. I told Avery I appreciated the opportunity, but had to decline due to a medical issue I'd been dealing with. Nothing serious, but it made working long private events difficult. Avery's smile never wavered, but their tone shifted slightly. They said this was a valued guest with specific requests, that refusing could indicate I wasn't suited for customer-facing positions, that the crew bar assignment I currently had was actually quite coveted, and maybe someone more flexible would be better suited for it. The threat wasn't even subtle. Do this, or lose the job that kept me employed, that sent money home to my family, that provided the stability I'd built my life around. I tried a different approach, said I'd be happy to help coordinate bartending service, but maybe someone else could actually staff the event since I wasn't experienced with suite-level service. Avery said the request was specifically for me, that the passenger had been clear about wanting me personally, and that arrangements had already been made. I was scheduled for tomorrow evening, 8 p.m. Suite 418. Dress code was standard crew formal, and I should bring everything needed for a full bar service, including premium liquors. I went straight to Simon after that meeting. He looked resigned when I told him what happened, like he'd expected exactly this outcome. He said I had 2 choices. Go to the suite and deal with whatever happened there, knowing that reporting it afterward would accomplish nothing and likely cost me my job. Or refuse, face the employment consequences, and hope I could find another position quickly enough to avoid financial disaster. Neither option was good. Both involved sacrificing something, my safety or my livelihood. And that calculation was what made the whole situation so viciously effective. Simon said he'd go with me if I wanted, wait outside the suite, be available if things went wrong. But we both knew that wouldn't actually protect me. Whatever happened behind the closed door of a suite, with a passenger who'd paid thousands for privacy and access, that was beyond where crew solidarity could reach. The power dynamic was too extreme, the isolation too complete. Simon's presence outside wouldn't stop anything except maybe make me feel slightly less alone before walking into it. I spent that entire night trying to figure out a way around it. I considered faking an injury serious enough to require medical leave. I thought about just not showing up and facing the disciplinary consequences. I wondered if I could talk to other crew members, build some kind of collective refusal, safety in numbers. But every option fell apart under basic scrutiny. Medical leave required ship doctor approval, and ship doctors worked for the company. Not showing up meant immediate termination and being stuck wherever we docked next with no money and no way home. Other crew members had their own vulnerabilities, their own families depending on their income, their own fears about retaliation. The next morning, Simon was gone. His cabin was cleared out, his belongings removed, his name deleted from the crew roster like he'd never existed. I asked Avery what happened, where Simon went. They said he'd received notification of a family emergency and had disembarked at the previous port during the night. They said it was unfortunate, but these things happened, and they hoped his family situation resolved well. The way they said it, casual and unconcerned, made it clear this was a message. Simon had pushed too hard, talked too much, tried to interfere with passenger satisfaction, and had been removed. I was completely alone now. The person who tried to warn me was gone. The others who'd experienced what awaited me were scattered or silent. And I had approximately 8 hours before I was supposed to report to Suite 418. I thought about running. Just grabbing my stuff and walking off at the next port, abandoning the contract and the job and starting over somewhere. But I had debts, obligations, people depending on me. Running meant defaulting on all of it, meant admitting I couldn't protect myself, meant letting whoever was in that suite win without even trying to resist. I didn't go to the suite. When 8 p.m. came, I stayed in my cabin. When Avery called asking where I was, I said I was too ill to work. When they said a ship doctor needed to verify illness for schedule changes, I said fine, send them. The doctor came, found nothing physically wrong with me, and reported back. I was called to a disciplinary meeting the next morning. They didn't frame it as punishment for refusing the passenger's request. They framed it as failure to maintain professional standards, unreliability, making false medical claims to avoid work assignments. I was given a formal warning that went in my permanent employment file, told that my crew bar position was being reassigned to someone more dependable, and informed I'd be working housekeeping for the remainder of the contract. The passenger in Suite 418 stayed aboard for another week. I saw them occasionally in passing, always perfectly polite to crew, always smiling, always surrounded by staff providing exceptional service. I wondered how many times they'd made these requests. How many crew members had gone to that suite over the years? How many had been silenced by systems designed to protect profit over people? I wondered if management knew exactly what happened in there, or if they'd cultivated willful ignorance, choosing not to ask questions that might require them to act. I finished that contract in housekeeping, left cruise work entirely after it ended, and never went back. The pay cut hurt, the career change was difficult, rebuilding took years. But I got out, which is more than some people managed. I think about Simon sometimes, about how he tried to protect me and got removed for his trouble. I think about the 3 others he mentioned, the ones who went to Suite 418 and left afterward, carrying whatever happened there in silence, because speaking up meant nothing except additional harm. The cruise industry depends on crew members being desperate enough to accept conditions that would be unthinkable on land. We work 100-hour weeks for minimal pay, live in cramped quarters with no privacy, follow orders that sometimes put us in dangerous situations, and stay quiet about it because unemployment is worse than exploitation. Passengers never see this, never think about the power dynamics that make their vacation possible. They see smiling crew members providing exceptional service and assume it's genuine, assume we're happy, assume the system is fair. The passenger in Suite 418 is probably still sailing, still making requests, still getting exactly what they want because money and status mean management will provide it regardless of cost to crew. Simon is somewhere else. Maybe still working ships under a different company, maybe out of the industry entirely. The others who experienced whatever I avoided are living with memories I'll never fully understand. And I'm here, years later, finally talking about it because silence protects the system that enables these situations. Someone needs to say it out loud. Someone needs to confirm that yes, this happens. And no, there's no real recourse. And the choice comes down to your safety or your survival. And sometimes you can't have both. Would you refuse a direct order from your employer if it meant losing your income but potentially protecting yourself from harm? Or would you go and hope for the best? Be honest in the comments about what you'd actually do. My name is Javier, and I worked as a safety officer on cruise ships running Middle Eastern routes for 2 years before what I discovered during a routine lifeboat drill in 2020 destroyed any sense of privacy or security I'd ever felt aboard those vessels. I was 27 at the time, relatively new to the position, but experienced enough to handle the standard procedures that kept passengers and crew safe at sea. Lifeboat drills were part of the rhythm of cruise life. Mandatory checks we conducted regularly to ensure every piece of emergency equipment functioned properly and met safety regulations. It was boring work, honestly. Climbing into lifeboats and going through checklists, testing release mechanisms and communication equipment. Nothing ever went wrong during these inspections. They were just boxes to check, documentation to file, proof that we maintained standards. Until the day I found the phone hidden in Lifeboat 12. The drill was scheduled for a Tuesday morning when we were at sea between ports. No passengers around to interfere with crew operations. I was assigned to inspect lifeboats 10 through 15 on the starboard side. Standard stuff I'd done dozens of times. Each lifeboat could hold about 70 people and was packed with emergency supplies, first aid kits, water rations, survival equipment. My job was to verify everything was present and functional. Document the serial numbers, check expiration dates on medical supplies, make sure the boat itself showed no signs of damage or deterioration. Lifeboat 12 was fourth on my list that morning. Nothing distinguished it from any other boat in the davits along that side of the ship. I climbed inside, started my inspection at the bow, and worked backward. Everything seemed normal. Life vests properly stored, oars secured, emergency beacon functional, water containers sealed and within date. I was checking under the bench seating for the auxiliary supply containers when my hand brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. Wedged between the bench support and the hull was a phone, an older model smartphone wrapped in a plastic bag like someone had been protecting it from moisture. It wasn't secured or mounted as part of the emergency equipment, just hidden there deliberately by someone who wanted it out of sight but accessible. I pulled it out and examined it. The phone was powered off but looked functional, not damaged or corroded, despite being in a lifeboat exposed to salt air and weather. The plastic bag suggested whoever put it there visited regularly to check on it or retrieve it. I turned it on, not really thinking about privacy or whether I should, just curious about why someone would hide a phone in emergency equipment. It had battery life remaining, maybe 30%, and wasn't password protected. The home screen loaded, showing standard apps and a gallery icon with a number indicating thousands of stored files. I opened the gallery. The first image was a photo of a crew cabin, taken from an angle near the ceiling, looking down at a bed where someone was sleeping. I didn't recognize the person at first, but the cabin layout was familiar. Standard crew quarters, the kind I lived in myself. 2 bunks, minimal personal space, the institutional feeling every crew cabin had. I swiped to the next image, another sleeping crew member, different cabin, same ceiling angle, then another, and another. I kept swiping, and my stomach started to tighten as I realized what I was looking at. Someone had been systematically photographing crew members in their private spaces. The images weren't just sleeping shots. There were photos of crew members changing clothes, getting out of showers, in various states of undress and vulnerability. The angles suggested cameras placed high up, maybe in ventilation grates or light fixtures. positioned to capture everything happening in those small private spaces we thought were secure. I recognized faces, people I worked with, people I saw in the crew mess every day, people who had no idea they'd been photographed in their most private moments. Then I found photos of myself. Dozens of them. Me sleeping in my bunk, face clearly visible. Me changing into my uniform before shifts. Me in the shower, water running, completely unaware anyone was watching. The photos were time-stamped, spanning back at least 4 months. 4 months of surveillance I'd never suspected, never noticed, never had any reason to think was happening. I felt physically sick looking at them, seeing myself through someone else's eyes, realizing how completely my privacy had been violated. I kept scrolling, trying to understand the scope of what I'd found. The gallery was organized into folders, each labeled with a crew member's name. There were maybe 30 different folders, each containing anywhere from a dozen to over 100 images and videos. The videos were worse than the photos. Longer recordings of people sleeping, showing hours of footage, suggesting whoever set up these cameras checked them regularly and archived everything. Some videos had audio, capturing private conversations, phone calls home to family, intimate moments people shared with roommates they trusted. I noticed something else as I went through the folders. Many of the names I didn't recognize. The timestamps on those photos went back over a year, but those crew members weren't currently aboard. They'd finished contracts and moved on, or transferred to other ships, or quit entirely. And whoever had these images still had them, stored and organized like a collection. That realization was somehow worse than finding my own photos. This wasn't recent. This had been happening for a long time, across multiple crew rotations, and none of us had known. I immediately took the phone to ship security. Eric ran security operations on our vessel, a serious guy who'd worked cruise ships for maybe a decade and had seen pretty much everything. I walked into his office, put the phone on his desk, and told him where I'd found it and what was on it. I watched his expression change as he scrolled through the gallery, his professional composure cracking as he realized what he was looking at. He asked me detailed questions about exactly where in the lifeboat I'd found it, whether I'd touched anything else, whether anyone had seen me take it. He said this was serious, potentially criminal depending on the jurisdictions involved, and he'd need to document everything properly. Eric told me to write a complete statement about the discovery while he secured the phone as evidence. He said he'd need to involve higher management and possibly law enforcement when we reached the next port. He thanked me for bringing it to him immediately and said I'd done the right thing. He asked me not to discuss the discovery with other crew members yet, since we didn't know who was responsible and alerting them might compromise any investigation. I agreed, wrote my statement, and left feeling like at least the situation was being handled by people with authority to actually do something about it. 2 days passed. I didn't hear anything from security or management about the phone. I tried to ask Eric about it during a safety briefing, and he pulled me aside afterward and said very quietly that the matter was being handled through appropriate channels and I shouldn't worry about it further. Something about his tone felt off, less reassuring and more dismissive than I'd expected. I asked specifically what was being done to remove the cameras from crew cabins, since people were still being filmed, presumably. And Eric said that investigation was ongoing, and I'd be notified when there were updates. That night, I returned to my cabin after my shift ended around 11 p.m. My roommate was already asleep, and I tried to be quiet as I got ready for bed. That's when I noticed the envelope on my bunk, just a standard white envelope with nothing written on it, sealed. I opened it and found a single photograph inside. It was a picture of me in Eric's office, holding that phone, taken from an angle that showed me clearly examining the screen. The photo was sharp, well lit, taken from somewhere in Eric's office while I'd been sitting there 2 days earlier. On the back of the photo, someone had written in neat handwriting, "Curiosity is noted." I couldn't breathe for a few seconds. Someone had photographed me in the security office while I was reporting the surveillance phone. That meant either the cameras extended into security spaces, which should have been impossible, or someone in security was involved. Either possibility was terrifying. The message on the back suggested whoever was doing this knew I'd found their phone, knew I'd reported it, and wanted me to understand they could reach me anywhere, even in spaces that should have been secure. I went back to Eric immediately, woke him up even though it was late, and showed him the photo. I watched his face as he looked at it, trying to read whether he was genuinely shocked or performing shock. He asked where I'd gotten it, and I told him it had been left in my cabin. He said that shouldn't be possible, that cabin access was restricted to assigned occupants and security personnel with override authorization. I pointed out that apparently a lot of things that shouldn't be possible were happening on this ship, and maybe we needed to escalate this beyond internal security. Eric told me he'd already escalated it, that corporate security was aware and conducting their own investigation. He said the phone I'd found had been sent to corporate offices for forensic analysis. He couldn't tell me more than that due to the ongoing investigation. I asked him directly if he knew who'd taken the photo of me in his office. He said he didn't, that his office didn't have cameras as far as he knew, and that someone must have accessed it while we were both distracted. His answers felt rehearsed, careful, like he was choosing words that wouldn't commit him to anything specific. I stopped sleeping well after that. Every night in my cabin, I'd search for cameras, checking vents and light fixtures, and any place something small could be hidden. I never found anything, but that didn't mean they weren't there. The photos I'd seen proved these cameras existed, proved they were sophisticated enough to avoid detection, proved someone had the access and technical knowledge to install them throughout crew areas. My roommate asked why I was acting paranoid, and I couldn't explain without revealing what I'd found, which Eric had told me not to discuss. Other crew members started acting strangely around me. Small things, like people avoiding conversations in the corridors, or changing subjects when I approached groups in the crew mess. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it, becoming paranoid from the stress, or if word had somehow spread that I'd discovered something I shouldn't have. The isolation was suffocating. I'd found evidence of massive privacy violations affecting dozens of people, reported it through proper channels, and somehow ended up feeling like I was the problem. 3 weeks after I found the phone, Eric called me to his office again. He said the investigation had concluded that the phone had been determined to be personal property of a former crew member who'd left the ship months ago. The images were explained as personal recordings that person had made without authorization. But since they were no longer employed, there was no one to discipline. The company was implementing new privacy policies and conducting sweeps for unauthorized electronic devices in crew areas. The matter was considered closed. I asked about the photo that had been left in my cabin, the one showing me in his office. Eric said that was likely unrelated. Possibly someone's idea of a prank, nothing to worry about. I asked how a prank photo could show me holding evidence in a security investigation that was supposedly confidential. He said he couldn't speculate, but the investigation was closed and I should focus on my regular duties. The conversation felt like a door shutting, a clear signal that continuing to push would have consequences for my employment. I requested a transfer to a different ship at the end of that cruise. My request was denied due to staffing needs. I worked 3 more months on that vessel, constantly aware of every space I occupied, every moment of vulnerability, every possibility that I was being watched and recorded. I never found another camera, never received another threatening photo, never got any real answers about what had happened or who was responsible. When my contract finally ended, I left cruise work entirely. I think about those folders on that phone sometimes, all those crew members organized by name with hundreds of private images. I think about how many of them never knew they'd been surveilled, finished their contracts, and went home carrying on with their lives, unaware their most private moments had been captured and stored by someone. I think about the crew members from earlier rotations whose photos were still on that phone, people who'd moved on a year or more ago, their images preserved in someone's collection. Most of all, I think about how quickly it got covered up. How a phone full of evidence disappeared into corporate channels and emerged as the property of a former employee who conveniently couldn't be questioned. How my report of a new photo was dismissed as a prank. How the investigation closed without anyone being held accountable, without the cameras being found, without any real protection being offered to current crew members who might still be under surveillance. The system protected itself, protected someone, but it definitely didn't protect us. If you found proof that someone had been secretly filming you for months in your most private moments, and your employer made that evidence disappear, would you keep pushing for answers, or would you walk away to protect yourself? Tell me honestly what you'd do. My name is Robin, and for 5 years, I operated tender boats on Mediterranean cruise routes, specifically the island destinations where ships couldn't dock directly, and we had to ferry passengers between vessel and shore. I was 44 in 2018 when something happened during what should have been a routine pickup that made me question everything I thought I understood about the waters I'd navigated for years. People think tender operation is simple work, just driving a small boat back and forth. But it requires constant attention to weather conditions, passenger safety, and the dozens of small details that keep everything running smoothly. You're responsible for getting sometimes hundreds of people on and off a moving ship safely, coordinating with multiple crews, managing schedules that depend on tides and port regulations. It was demanding work that I loved. Being out on the water instead of trapped inside the ship. Feeling the sun and wind, seeing these incredible coastlines up close. Until that evening, near a small rocky beach on the Greek islands, when I picked up passengers who shouldn't have existed. We'd been anchored off one of the smaller islands for the day. The kind of destination that attracted passengers looking for authentic experiences away from the crowded tourist ports. The island had maybe 3,000 residents. Rocky coastlines with hidden coves, ancient ruins scattered across hills covered in olive groves. Our tenders had been running all day, taking passengers ashore in the morning and bringing them back throughout the afternoon as they finished their explorations. I'd done maybe 15 runs already, was getting tired, but still had another few hours of operations before we'd secured everything for the night and headed back to the ship. It was around 6:30 in the evening, that golden hour when the sun starts dropping toward the horizon and everything gets bathed in warm light that photographers love. I was heading back to the ship empty after dropping off the last scheduled group of passengers at the main port. The route took me along the coastline, and I knew these waters well enough to take a slightly longer path that avoided some of the choppier areas where currents met. That path brought me close to a section of rocky coastline that wasn't accessible by road. Just steep cliffs dropping down to narrow strips of beach tucked between rock formations. I was maybe a quarter mile from one of these small beaches when I noticed movement. People were standing at the waterline, waving toward me. My first thought was annoyance, because this beach wasn't an approved pickup location, wasn't on our route, and I'd already been working for 9 hours. But tender operators don't ignore people waving from beaches, especially isolated ones where someone could be stranded or injured. I changed course and headed toward them, throttling down as I approached the shallow water near shore. As I got closer, I could make out 4 people standing at the edge of the water. They weren't moving much, just standing there with their arms raised in that universal signal for needing assistance. I couldn't see their faces clearly yet because of the angle of the sun behind them. But something about the scene felt slightly off in a way I couldn't immediately identify. The beach itself was small, maybe 30 feet of rocky sand between 2 jutting cliff faces, the kind of place you could only reach by boat or by climbing down some very steep terrain. I didn't see any hiking gear or beach equipment. Nothing that suggested they'd spent the day there intentionally. I brought the tender in as close as I safely could, cutting the engine and letting momentum carry me toward shore. That's when I got a better look at them, and the first wave of unease hit me. Their clothing was wrong. Not modern swimwear or the casual tourist clothes everyone wore, but older style clothing. One woman wore a dress that looked like something from maybe the 70s. Another had on a shirt with a collar style I associated with old photographs. The men with them had similar outdated clothing, and all of it was soaking wet, clinging to them, water running off in streams like they'd just climbed out of the ocean. I called out asking if they were okay, if they needed medical assistance, standard questions for any unusual pickup. Nobody responded verbally. They just started wading into the water toward the tender. The water was only knee-deep where they were, and I expected them to struggle a bit with the small waves. But they moved through it with this strange fluid grace that didn't match how people normally walk in shallow surf. As they reached the tender and started climbing aboard, I got hit with the smell. Not normal seawater smell, not even the smell of people who'd been swimming in the ocean all day, but something stale and wrong. Brackish water mixed with decay, like seaweed that had been rotting in a tidal pool. They climbed into the tender without any of the normal clumsiness passengers usually showed. No grabbing for handholds, no laughing nervousness about balancing in a moving boat, just smooth, silent movements as they settled into the seats. Water poured off them, pooling on the deck in quantities that seemed excessive even for people who'd been fully submerged. I watched it spread, this dark water that looked thicker than it should, and the smell intensified enough that I had to breathe through my mouth. I introduced myself, started asking the standard questions about where they'd come from and which ship they were with, assuming they'd gotten separated from a tender group somehow. None of them responded. They just sat there, dripping, staring straight ahead with these expressions I couldn't read. Not grateful for the rescue, not panicked or upset, just blank. Empty. I felt the temperature drop despite the warm evening air, felt goosebumps rise on my arms, even though it made no sense. I decided to just get them back to the ship and let guest services sort out whoever they were and how they'd ended up stranded. I moved toward the helm to restart the engine, turning my back on them for maybe 5 seconds to check my instruments and radio in that I was bringing unexpected passengers. When I turned around to ask for their ship cards so I could document the pickup, the tender was empty. Completely empty. Just wet seats where they'd been sitting, water still pooling on the deck. But no people. Nobody. I looked over the sides, thinking maybe they'd jumped overboard for some reason. But the water around the tender was clear and empty. I could see straight down to the rocky bottom in the shallow water. And there was nobody there. I stood there frozen, trying to process what I'd just seen. 4 people had climbed into my tender. I'd watched them sit down and been standing maybe 6 feet away from them. I turned away for seconds, not even long enough for someone to quietly slip over the side. And they were gone. I checked every part of the boat, looking under seats, behind equipment lockers, anywhere someone could possibly hide. A 12-meter tender boat doesn't have many hiding spots, and I confirmed it was completely empty, except for me. The water on the seats was still there, though. I could see it, dark puddles soaking into the cushions, spreading across the non-slip deck surface. I knelt down and touched it, and my hand came away with water that smelled like that same brackish decay. It was cold, colder than ocean water should be, even accounting for the evening temperature. I looked back at the beach where I'd picked them up. Empty, just rocks and sand and the evening shadows lengthening across the cove. I radioed back to the ship, reported the situation as calmly as I could manage. The coordinator asked me to repeat what I'd said because it didn't make sense, and honestly, I didn't have a better explanation the second time. I told them I'd picked up 4 people from a beach, they'd boarded my tender, and then they'd vanished. Silence on the radio for a few seconds, then instructions to return to the ship immediately and report to the tender operations supervisor. The ride back took maybe 15 minutes, and I spent it trying to convince myself I'd hallucinated or misunderstood what happened. Maybe they'd never been real. Maybe the long day and the lighting had created some kind of optical illusion. But the water was real. I could still smell it, still see it pooling on the deck, physical evidence that someone or something had been in that tender, dripping quantities of cold, brackish water. When I got back to the ship, the operations supervisor was waiting. Maisie, who'd been running tenders for even longer than I had, took one look at my face and pulled me aside before I had to give an official statement. She asked what happened, and I told her everything exactly as I experienced it. The people on the beach, their outdated clothing, the way they moved, the smell, their silence, and their impossible disappearance. Maisie listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me a question I hadn't expected. She asked if this happened near the North Cove, the one with the 2 cliff formations that created a narrow beach. I confirmed that was exactly where it happened, and Maisie got very quiet. Then she told me something that made my blood run cold. In 1973, an excursion boat carrying tourists from a cruise ship had capsized in a storm near that exact cove. The boat had been overloaded, the weather had turned worse than forecasts predicted, and it had gone down in shallow water near those rocks. 17 people had drowned. Their bodies recovered over several days from that beach and the surrounding waters. The incident had led to major changes in tender operation regulations and safety protocols across the entire industry. That cove had been off limits for cruise operations ever since, considered both dangerous due to the currents and rocks, and sort of informally avoided because of the tragedy associated with it. Maisie said she'd heard stories over the years from other tender operators, whispers about seeing people on that beach who vanished when approached, about picking up passengers who disappeared during transport, about the smell of decay that sometimes drifted from that section of coastline even decades after the accident. She'd never experienced it herself, had written it off as maritime superstition, the kind of ghost stories that accumulated around any tragedy at sea. But she'd been operating tenders in these waters for 18 years and had heard the same basic story maybe half a dozen times from different operators who had no connection to each other. I asked why nobody officially reported these incidents or investigated them. And Maisie gave me a look that said I already knew the answer. What would we report? That we saw people who then vanished? That we experienced something that couldn't be explained by rational means? We'd be labeled unreliable at best, psychologically unfit for duty at worst. The cruise industry ran on schedules and efficiency and maintaining an atmosphere of safe, predictable vacation experience. Ghosts and disappearing passengers didn't fit that model, so they got quietly ignored by anyone with the authority to acknowledge them. I went back to the tender after talking with Maisie, wanting to check on the water one more time before filing my official report. The seats were still damp, which made sense given how soaked they'd been. But when I examined the water more closely under the deck lights, I noticed something I'd missed in the fading daylight. The water had left residue on the seats, a kind of sediment that looked like fine silt mixed with decomposed organic matter. I took samples with some equipment bags, sealed them, and kept them in my locker. I never had them analyzed professionally, didn't know who I'd even take them to, but I kept them as proof that something physical had happened. My official report stated I'd approached the North Cove to investigate what I thought were stranded passengers. But upon closer inspection, the beach was empty, and I'd returned to the ship. Nobody questioned it. The coordinator noted it in the log, and operations continued normally. I ran tenders for another year after that incident, but I never took the route that passed close to that cove again. I always took the longer path, the one that stayed farther from shore. And if anyone asked why, I'd tell them the currents were better on that route, even though we both knew I was avoiding something I couldn't adequately explain. I think about those 4 people sometimes, about their outdated clothing and their silence and the way they moved through the water like it was their natural element. I think about the smell of decay and the cold, brackish water they left behind, physical evidence that contradicted every rational explanation for what I'd experienced. I think about the excursion boat that went down in that cove 45 years before I picked up passengers who shouldn't exist. And I wonder if some tragedies leave marks on places that persist longer than anyone wants to acknowledge. The ocean keeps its dead, that's what old sailors say. And maybe some of them keep trying to get back to the ships they never reached. Keep waving from beaches they drowned near. Keep climbing into tenders that can't actually carry them home. I left tender operations in 2019 and moved to a shore-based position in port management. I still work around boats and water, but I'm grateful every day that I don't have to navigate those isolated coves where the past might still be trying to reach the present. Some waters carry more than just fish and currents, and some passengers are still trying to complete journeys that ended decades ago. If you picked up passengers who climbed aboard your boat and then vanished without explanation, leaving behind physical proof they'd been there, would you keep working those same waters, or would you find a different route? Drop your answer below. My name is Gavin, and I spent 23 years working as an assistant cruise director for the same company before my final voyage in 2021 forced me to confront something I'd been ignoring for longer than I want to admit. I was 52 years old when it ended, had dedicated more than half my life to coordinating entertainment programs and passenger activities across dozens of ships and hundreds of voyages. The work had become my identity, my routine, my entire existence. I lived on ships for 10 months out of every year, took my brief shore leaves in hotel rooms near ports because I'd never bothered maintaining a permanent residence anywhere. The company was my home, the crew was my family, and the endless cycle of embarkation and disembarkation was the only rhythm my life followed. Until I started waking up in places I didn't remember going to, holding things I didn't remember touching, and realizing that somewhere along the way, I'd lost pieces of time I could never get back. The first incident I can clearly recall happened about 8 weeks before my contract was set to end. I woke up at 4 a.m. standing in a crew corridor on deck 3, nowhere near my cabin or any area I had reason to be in at that hour. I was fully dressed in my uniform, shoes on, key card in my pocket. But I had absolutely no memory of getting out of bed or walking there. The last thing I remembered was climbing into my bunk around midnight after finishing paperwork in my office. 6 hours were just gone, and I'd apparently spent some of that time wandering the ship while completely unconscious of doing so. I went back to my cabin and tried to rationalize it. Stress, exhaustion, the accumulated fatigue of 2 decades at sea finally catching up with me. I'd been working cruise ships since I was 29, had climbed through various positions until landing the assistant director role that I'd held for the past 12 years. Long hours were normal, burnout was common, and plenty of veteran crew members experienced cognitive issues from the constant travel and irregular sleep schedules. I convinced myself it was a one-time thing, a wake-up call that I needed to actually retire when this contract ended, instead of immediately signing another one like I'd done every year prior. But it kept happening. 3 nights later, I woke up in a storage area near the theater, standing among racks of costumes and props, holding a clipboard with inventory lists I didn't remember pulling. A week after that, I found myself in the crew mess at 3 in the morning, sitting at a table with the manifest system open on a tablet in front of me. Crew personnel files displayed on the screen. Each time, hours would be missing from my memory. I'd go to bed at my normal time and then suddenly become aware of myself in some random location with no recollection of the time between. I tried talking to Aziel, the ship's doctor who I'd known for years across multiple assignments. He ran basic cognitive tests, checked for signs of stroke or neurological damage, asked about my sleep quality and stress levels. Everything came back normal. He suggested I might be experiencing a form of sleepwalking, possibly stress-induced, and recommended I consider taking medical leave to get more comprehensive evaluation on shore. But taking medical leave meant ending my contract early, losing the completion bonus I'd been counting on, and admitting that after 23 years, I couldn't handle the work anymore. I thanked him for the tests and told him I'd think about it, knowing I wouldn't follow through. The episodes continued, increasing in frequency. I started finding evidence of my nighttime activities. Things I'd apparently done while in these fugue states that I had no memory of doing. Notes in my handwriting that I didn't remember writing. Emails sent from my account at 3 and 4 in the morning. Work completed that should have taken hours, but happened during time I couldn't account for. Other crew members started mentioning seeing me in various parts of the ship during late hours, always alone, always looking focused on some task. When I'd ask what I was doing, they'd describe normal work activities, nothing suspicious or concerning, just me apparently working extended shifts I had no recollection of. The really disturbing part was how productive these lost hours apparently were. Projects I'd been putting off would suddenly be finished. Problems I'd been struggling with would have solutions implemented. My supervisor actually complimented me several times on my renewed dedication and work ethic, mentioning how impressed they were that I was tackling issues at all hours. I smiled and accepted the praise while internally panicking, because I genuinely didn't remember doing any of it. It was like someone else was operating my body while my conscious mind was completely absent, and that someone was apparently better at my job than I was. I started trying to track the lost time, keeping a journal where I'd note the last thing I remembered before going to bed, and the first thing I was aware of when I regained consciousness. The gaps were substantial, sometimes 5 or 6 hours, sometimes entire nights, where I'd go to bed and then suddenly be aware of myself the next morning, having apparently worked through the darkness, with no memory of it. The journal entries started showing a pattern. The episodes happened more frequently as we got deeper into the voyage, increasing from once every few days to nearly every night during the final 3 weeks of my contract. Other long-term crew members started looking at me strangely. Not with concern exactly, but with something like recognition mixed with pity. People who'd worked ships for 15, 20 years would make eye contact with me in corridors, and quickly look away. Or they'd start to say something and then stop themselves. I got the sense they knew something I didn't, that there was some shared understanding among veteran crew that I was only now encountering. But when I tried to ask directly, they'd brush it off or change the subject. And I was left with this growing paranoia that everyone understood what was happening to me except me. The breaking point came on my final night aboard, the last evening before we docked, and I was scheduled to disembark for what I'd been telling myself would be retirement, but was really just an extended shore leave before I signed another contract. I went to bed around 11, exhausted from the turnaround day chaos of passengers leaving and boarding. The next thing I was aware of, I was sitting alone in the crew mess at 4 in the morning. The lights were dimmed to overnight mode, the space completely empty, except for me. And spread across the table in front of me were photographs. 47 Polaroid pictures arranged in neat rows. I picked up the first one and felt my blood turn cold. It showed me sleeping in my bunk, taken from an angle above the bed, looking down at my face, clearly visible against the pillow. The photo was dated, stamped in the white border in that distinctive Polaroid style. The date was from 3 years ago, a voyage I barely remembered, one of dozens that had blurred together. I picked up the next photo. Same composition, me sleeping, different date from 2 years ago. I went through them methodically, and the horror built with each image. They spanned back 7 years, showed me sleeping in different crew cabins on different ships, taken from angles that suggested someone had been standing over me while I was unconscious. The photos weren't all from the same ship or even the same year. They showed me in various uniforms across different vessels I'd worked on, in crew quarters with slightly different layouts, with different personal items visible in the backgrounds. Someone had been photographing me while I slept for years, across multiple ships and assignments, following me or accessing my cabins whenever I moved to new vessels. The consistency of the angles suggested the same person taking all of them, standing in the same relative position each time, always above me, always close enough to capture clear facial details in the dim light of sleeping quarters. The most recent photos were from this current voyage. I could recognize my current cabin, my current belongings. The dates went up to 4 nights ago, meaning whoever was taking these had access to my cabin regularly and recently. But what absolutely destroyed me was realizing that I should have heard someone in my cabin taking photos. I was a light sleeper normally, always had been. Woke up if someone knocked on my door or if there was unusual noise in the corridor. Yet someone had apparently been entering my cabin repeatedly for years, getting close enough to photograph me sleeping. And I'd never once woken up or been aware of it happening. I sat there staring at those photos, trying to process the implications. The lost time, the activities I didn't remember, the work that got done while I had no awareness, the way other veteran crew members looked at me with that knowing pity. I thought about 23 years at sea, about how many nights I'd spent sleeping in crew cabins on different ships, about how much of my life existed only in fragments between voyages with no continuous memory tying it all together. I thought about how I'd never questioned the gaps, never wondered why so much time felt hazy or absent. Never considered that maybe those gaps weren't natural aging or stress-related memory issues, but something deliberately taken from me. The photos were proof that my privacy had been violated for years, but they also suggested something worse. If someone could access my cabin regularly enough to take photos spanning nearly a decade without me ever waking up or noticing, what else had they done during that time? What else had happened while I was in those fugue states I couldn't remember? The episodes I'd been experiencing over the past 2 months weren't new phenomena. They were just the first times I'd become aware during them regaining consciousness mid-activity. Instead of just waking up the next morning with gaps, I'd learned not to question. I gathered the photos and went straight to security, even though it was 4:30 in the morning. I showed them everything, explained the lost time and the episodes, and my growing fear that something had been wrong for years. The security officer on duty documented my report, took the photos as evidence, and said they'd investigate thoroughly. But the way he looked at the photos, without surprise or shock, just this weary resignation, told me he'd seen something like this before. He asked how long I'd been working for the company, and when I said 23 years, he nodded like that explained something. He told me, very carefully, that long-term crew members sometimes developed issues related to the extended time at sea, the isolation, the repetitive nature of the work, the lack of normal life structure. He said the company had resources for people transitioning out of shipboard life, counseling and support services for crew members who dedicated decades to the work and needed help adjusting to retirement. The way he framed it made it sound like the photos were evidence of my deteriorating mental state, not evidence that someone had been systematically violating my privacy for years. He was suggesting, politely but clearly, that maybe I'd taken the photos myself during my fugue states and then forgotten, that this was all just more evidence that I needed to leave and get help. I left security and went back to the crew mess. The photos were gone, taken as evidence I'd probably never see again. I sat alone in that dimmed space and tried to remember the last time I'd felt fully present in my own life, fully aware of time passing continuously without gaps or missing hours. I couldn't remember. Somewhere over 2 decades at sea, I'd lost track of what continuous consciousness felt like. I'd learned to accept the gaps as normal, to not question why so much time felt fuzzy or absent, to just keep working and assume my memory issues were typical for someone who'd been at sea as long as I had. That morning, when we docked, I disembarked with my belongings and never went back. Not just to that ship, but to cruise work entirely. I broke my pattern for the first time in 23 years and didn't immediately start looking for my next contract. I found a small apartment on shore, a permanent address, a place that stayed in one location and didn't move across oceans while I slept. I tried to build a routine based on land time instead of ship time. Tried to relearn what it felt like to wake up in the same place I'd gone to sleep with, full memory of the hours between. The photos haunt me. 47 images across 7 years. But I'd been working ships for 23 years. How many photos existed from the earlier years I didn't see? How many times had someone stood over me while I slept in all those crew cabins, on all those different vessels? What had they done beyond taking pictures? And why had other crew members looked at me with that recognition, like they knew what was happening but couldn't or wouldn't explain? I think about all the long-term crew I worked with over the years, the people who'd been at sea for decades like me, who lived shipboard life as their only life, who seemed increasingly detached and automated in their work. I think about how many of them might have been experiencing the same lost time, the same fugue states, the same growing awareness that something was taking pieces of their lives while they couldn't remember or resist. I think about the company that employed us, that kept us working contracts back to back for years until we were more machine than human, running on patterns and routines with consciousness optional. The worst part is not knowing how much time I lost, not the hours here and there I became aware of missing, but the years, the decades of life that might have passed without me truly being present for it. What percentage of 23 years did I actually experience consciously? How much of my life existed only as gaps between voyages I barely remember? Did I ever make the choice to keep working ships? Or was that choice being made for me during hours I couldn't remember by some part of me that wasn't fully me anymore? I'm on shore now, have been for months, and the lost time has stopped. I go to bed and wake up in the same place, with full memory of the hours between. But I catch myself sometimes falling into old patterns, reaching for a key card that would open crew areas, checking schedules for voyages I'm no longer part of. Feeling the pull of a life that consumed me so completely, I stopped being able to tell where the work ended and I began. Recovery from 2 decades at sea isn't fast or simple, and some days I'm not sure how much of me survived intact. If you dedicated decades of your life to a job, and then discovered you couldn't remember huge portions of that time, that something or someone had been taking pieces of your life while you weren't aware, would you want to know the full truth, or would you rather never find out? Tell me which you'd choose in the comments. Thank you for watching this episode of Mr. Nightveil. These 10 crew testimonials reveal the hidden darkness aboard cruise ships that passengers never see. If you've experienced something similar or worked at sea with stories to share, the comments are open. Subscribe for more real horror from the people who live where others vacation. And remember that luxury always has a price someone else pays. Sweet dreams and safe travels.